The terror did not begin in a slum, it began in a mansion. A warm dining room glowing with gaslight, a silver pitcher of water cooling on a tray, and a sudden, inexplicable shiver running through the daughter of a family who believed themselves immune to the world's miseries. Within days, that same house, once filled with polite laughter and perfume, smelled of fever, vinegar, and fear. Typhoid moved through Victorian Britain like a phantom in the pipes, slipping past brass faucets and lace curtains, poisoning the wealthy with the same pitiless hand that struck the poor. Doctors whispered behind closed doors, servants feared touching the linens, and newspapers avoided printing what everyone dreaded to admit. No amount of money could keep death out of the water glass. Stay with me as we uncover how a disease born in contaminated wells invaded the most privileged homes of the 19th century. And before we continue, tap like, subscribe, and tell me where you're watching from. Your support helps these forgotten shadows rise again. The trouble entered the house quietly, as most Victorian tragedies did. No shattered window, no cry in the night, no hurried footsteps on the gravel drive. Instead, it waited on the polished sideboard of a Belgravia dining room, a crystal water pitcher that gleamed like a jewel beneath the soft glow of gaslight. Its facets caught the room's amber haze, scattering it into gentle fragments across the wallpapered walls. To any visitor, it was a symbol of refinement, purity, and wealth. Yet within that glittering surface, a danger stirred that not even the servants dared imagine. The butler, Mr. Havisham, had filled it himself earlier that evening. His hands, trained through decades of service, moved with deliberate grace. Tilt the jug, wipe the lip, carry it in both palms like a holy relic. He had performed this act for countless dinners in countless seasons, each one indistinguishable in its routine. But tonight, he hesitated. As he poured the water into the waiting decanter, he noticed something peculiar, a faint clouding as the liquid settled, like a whisper, disturbing the clarity. It vanished as quickly as it appeared, and Havisham blinked it away, telling himself it must have been the trick of the lamplight. After all, the family's water came from a reputable supplier. Pure, filtered, guaranteed. That was the promise printed in elegant type on the pamphlet tucked into the kitchen drawer. He replaced the cork and said nothing. When the family gathered for supper, the pitcher stood between silver candlesticks, its presence as expected as the clinking of cutlery or the murmured grace before the meal. Lady Harrowfield reached for it first, lifting the delicate handle with her gloved fingers. The water slid smoothly into her glass, sending a cool mist into the warm dining room air. She complimented its clarity. Her husband nodded with practiced indifference. Their daughter, Cecily, took her own sip and sighed, grateful for anything that could temper the late summer heat pressing through the heavy drapes. Only the governess, Miss Clark, seemed unsettled. She watched the pitcher with a furrowed brow, as though listening for some silent confession it refused to give. For days now, she had sensed a strange unease in the household, a tightening in her chest, a heaviness in her limbs. She blamed exhaustion, perhaps the children's lessons or the lingering anxieties of London life. But as she lifted her glass, she paused. The water trembled slightly, though her hand was steady. Something in her intuition whispered caution. She drank anyway. By morning, the first signs appeared. Miss Clark's face, normally pale as ivory, now carried the faintest flush. Her breath rasped softly as she descended the staircase. The servants exchanged glances, none daring to voice their worries. The wealthy did not fall ill in the same manner as the poor, at least. That was the myth Victorian London clung to, like a comforting shawl. But as the hours passed, and Miss Clark's fever crept higher, the myth began to unravel. The family summoned the physician, who arrived with immaculate gloves and a polished bag that clicked open like a confession box. He examined her in the guest room, his expression guarded. When he returned to the drawing room, He spoke softly, his voice nearly drowned by the ticking of the mantel clock. "A common fever," he assured them. "Nothing alarming." Yet his eyes betrayed him, drifting, doubtful, uneasy. Outside, the fog curled around the lampposts, dense and sweet with the scent of coal. Within the house, the crystal pitcher sat empty, its surface glistening faintly, as though pleased with its deception. No one imagined that its clear, cool contents were the first thread in a tapestry of sickness, soon to unfurl across even the richest quarters of London. And still, the household carried on unaware that death had already been poured into their glasses. By the second morning, the light through Miss Clark's bedroom curtains had taken on a peculiar quality, too sharp at the edges, too cold despite the warm season. It slid across her bedsheets like a blade of polished glass, illuminating the beads of perspiration forming along her hairline. She had always been a figure of quiet composure, the sort of woman who moved through the Harrowfield household like a breath of lavender, soft, orderly, unseen except when needed. But now she lay stiff against her pillows, her face tinged not with its usual gentle pallor but with a flushed, heated glow that unsettled even the most stoic of servants. Mrs. Keene, the housekeeper, stood at the doorway wringing her hands in the folds of her apron. She had knocked twice before entering, though she already knew Miss Clark was too weak to reply. The governess managed a faint smile as Mrs. Keene approached with a basin of cool water. "You didn't sleep at all, did you?" the housekeeper whispered, dipping a cloth and pressing it to Miss Clark's brow. "Just a touch of fatigue," Miss Clark murmured. But the words quivered, unsteady, barely held together by the thin ribbon of her resolve. Her breath caught between syllables, and a tremor passed through her hands as she clutched the sheets, a tremor far too pronounced for mere tiredness. Mrs. Keene had seen illness before. She had nursed her own husband through a fever years ago, had wiped the brows of coughing children in the poorer streets of London, places where sickness moved with a kind of grim familiarity. But this was different. This was wealthy Belgravia, where ailments were meant to be dainty, manageable, whispered about in polite euphemisms, not this spreading heat beneath the skin, not this unsettling dryness of the mouth, not this growing look of fear in Miss Clark's usually steady eyes. Downstairs, Lady Harrowfield paced the morning room, glancing repeatedly at the clock. Her silk dressing gown brushed noiselessly against the floor as she moved. The faintest hint of irritation lined her features. "The governess mustn't remain ill for long," she muttered to her husband. "Cecily's lessons will fall behind." Lord Harrowfield, absorbed in his newspaper, gave no reply beyond a thoughtful hum. But beneath the crisp rustle of the pages, his fingers tapped anxiously against the armrest. He had not forgotten how the physician's voice faltered the previous evening, how he avoided meeting their gaze when asked for reassurance. In the nursery, Cecily sat with her hands folded neatly in her lap, waiting for Miss Clark to appear. She had never seen the governess look anything but calm, a pillar of routine in a home that prized appearances above all. The idea that she might be truly unwell made the world tilt strangely, like looking through a glass warped by heat. By afternoon, Miss Clark's fever had sharpened. Her cheeks, once pale as pressed rose petals, now burned with a feverish crimson. Her lips cracked. Her pulse fluttered beneath the cool cloth like a trapped bird. When she attempted to sit upright, dizziness overtook her, and she sank back against the pillows with a soft gasp. Mrs. Keene hurried to fetch the physician again. He arrived with the same polished bag, the same immaculate gloves, but something in his demeanor had changed. He examined Miss Clark in grim silence, listening to her heartbeat, pressing gently against her abdomen, watching the rise and fall of her breath. When he finally straightened, the room seemed to tighten around him. "I must ask," he began, his voice low, "has anyone else in the household experienced any stomach pains? Any fevers? Any weakness?" The question struck the air like a dropped candlestick. Mrs. Keene exchanged a troubled glance with the footman who had assisted her that morning. Lady Harrowfield, summoned moments later, lifted her chin sharply. "Surely you don't suggest something contagious?" she demanded, though fear flickered behind her eyes. The physician hesitated a hesitation that said everything. Outside, the afternoon fog thickened, drifting down the street in a pale, sweet-smelling shroud. Inside, the Harrowfield home dimmed, shadows lengthening along the wallpapered walls as though the house itself was holding its breath. Miss Clark whispered for water, and somewhere downstairs, the empty crystal pitcher gleamed faintly in the dimming light, as if remembering the first life it had touched. The evening of the dinner party glimmered with the sort of polished elegance the Harrowfields prided themselves on, the clinking of silverware, the soft murmur of conversation, the glow of gaslight reflected in crystal and pearl. Yet beneath the sheen of refinement, an uneasy tremor ran through the household, too faint for the guests to notice, but felt acutely by those who worked behind the scenes. Miss Clark was bedridden upstairs. Her absence hovered over the evening like a ghost that refused to stay confined to its room. Both Mr. Havisham and Mrs. Keene had attempted to persuade Lady Harrowfield to cancel the gathering, but the suggestion had been dismissed with a curt flick of the wrist. "Nonsense," she said, adjusting a brooch at her throat. "One governess with a fever does not signal catastrophe. Our guests expect an evening free of unpleasantness." So the invitation stood. The dining room was dressed in its best attire, and the household's dread was carefully tucked away behind silver trays and folded linens. The guests arrived one by one, stepping from carriages into the lamplit foyer with a flourish of silk and polished shoes. There was Mr. and Mrs. Pennington, who wore their wealth like armor, Miss Everleigh, whose laughter carried just a shade too brightly, and Dr. Ashcombe, a physician with a reputation for discretion, a quality that made him particularly valued among London's elite. They gathered in the drawing-room for aperitifs, exchanging pleasant greetings that felt thinner than usual. The faint scent of overripe flowers drifted from the centerpiece, mingling with perfume and cologne in a way that seemed strangely cloying. Even the air felt heavy, as though the house resented being forced into gaiety on a night when one of its own lay trembling upstairs. Lady Harrowfield entered last, offering a practiced smile that nearly masked the strain at the corners of her mouth. "Shall we?" she said, gesturing toward the dining room. The meal began smoothly enough. The table glittered with crystal glasses, all filled, at Lord Harrowfield's request, from the same impressive water pitcher that had presided over so many refined suppers. Conversations fluttered like birds against windows, lively but trapped, restless, and oddly discordant. Miss Everleigh was the first to falter. Halfway through recounting a story from her recent countryside visit, she paused, pressing a hand lightly to her temple. "A sudden heat," she whispered with an apologetic smile. "Nothing of concern." She lifted her water glass and took a delicate sip. Moments later, Mr. Pennington let out a soft cough, followed by a second, deeper one that drew several glances. He laughed it off, waving a hand dismissively, though a sheen of perspiration had begun to glisten along his brow. Mrs. Keene, stationed just outside the doorway, noticed. Her heart swelled with dread. She sought out the butler with her eyes, but Mr. Havisham refused to meet her gaze. He carried the water pitcher with hands that trembled almost imperceptibly. The conversation lulled when the fish course was served. Dr. Ashcombe, seated nearest the head of the table, tapped his fork against the porcelain plate in quiet contemplation. His trained eye noted each symptom: the flushed cheeks, the glassy stares, the subtle shifting of guests uncomfortably in their seats. "I trust you are all well?" he asked lightly, though his tone betrayed the question's seriousness. A murmur of polite affirmations followed, but no conviction accompanied them. As dessert arrived, Miss Everleigh excused herself, rising too quickly and gripping the back of her chair as dizziness overtook her. Lady Harrowfield signalled a footman to escort her to the retiring room. The other guests exchanged careful, sidelong glances, each wondering the same thought they dared not speak. Was it contagious? Yet the evening continued, upheld precariously by the Victorian insistence on civility even in the face of encroaching dread. Toasts were exchanged, though fewer glasses were raised. Smiles were offered, though stiff and strained. And through it all, the crystal water pitcher gleamed at the centre of the table like a silent accomplice. When the final guest departed and the front door closed with a hollow thud, the house seemed to exhale a long, weary sigh that echoed faintly through its corridors. Lady Harrowfield lifted her hand to her throat and sank into a chair, the exhaustion she had masked all evening leaving her vulnerable at last. Upstairs, Miss Clark tossed in feverish delirium. Downstairs, a cold draught drifted through the dining room, stirring the unused glasses. And, before morning, at least 3 guests would wake with the same creeping heat beneath their skin. The first undeniable sign that the Harrowfield home was no longer merely a setting of wealth and elegance, but the cradle of something far more sinister. Dr. Pembroke arrived just after sunrise, summoned urgently by a footman whose breath came in uneven bursts as he delivered the message. Though accustomed to early calls, the wealthy often demanded attention before the day's bustle threatened their privacy. Something in the young man's voice unsettled him, a quiver, a tremor, not fear exactly, but the shadow of it. He stepped from his carriage into a mist that clung thickly to the Harrowfield estate, swallowing the morning light. The gravel crunched softly beneath his boots, each step sounding strangely muffled, as though the fog wished to hush him. When Mrs. Keene met him at the door, her usually steady gaze held a flicker of desperation. "She's worsened, sir," she whispered. "The governess, Miss Clark, and there may be others." Dr. Pembroke paused mid-removal of his gloves. "Others?" Mrs. Keene nodded, glancing toward the shadowed hallway. "Guests from last night. Several have sent word. Fever, sir. Sudden." An invisible weight settled over the entry hall, as dense as the fog outside. Dr. Pembroke adjusted his spectacles and followed Mrs. Keene upstairs, his medical bag thumping lightly against his leg. The air grew warmer as they ascended, thick with the low hum of sickness, the rustle of sheets, the occasional moan. The scent of sweat mingled with lavender sachets placed by hopeful servants. Miss Clark lay propped against a mound of pillows, her eyes half-lidded, her breath shallow. The fever had painted her cheeks in deep carmine hues, and her pulse fluttered beneath Dr. Pembroke's fingers like fragile wings. "How long since she first showed symptoms?" he asked quietly. 2 days, sir. At first she said it was fatigue, but then," Mrs. Keene's voice cracked, "then she couldn't stand." Dr. Pembroke placed a stethoscope to her chest, listening. The steady rasp of her breathing held a dark undercurrent, a dryness, a strain. He asked questions, simple ones, but her answers drifted like smoke, trailing off before reaching clarity. He moved next to her abdomen, pressing gently. She winced. He noted the tenderness, the heat, the faint mottling of the skin. And then he saw it, a faint rose-colored flush across her torso, a warning, a whisper of something more sinister than influenza or common fever. His stomach tightened. He washed his hands in the basin provided, scrubbing harder than necessary. "You must isolate her. Immediately," he said, drying his hands with a linen towel. Mrs. Keene hesitated. "Is it serious, sir?" He met her eyes, a brief, haunted look before glancing away. "I won't alarm the family prematurely, but this illness, it bears watching." The truth lodged like a stone in his throat. He had seen these patterns before, in cramped tenements, in the riverfront slums, in places where waste seeped into drinking water, where disease moved as swiftly as rumor. But here, in a home adorned with silk draperies and velvet upholstered chairs, The same signs had emerged. Impossible, or so society would claim. He descended the stairs with heavy steps. Lady Harrowfield awaited him in the morning room, her hands clasped tightly around a porcelain teacup. Lord Harrowfield stood near the mantel, stiff as a statue. "Well?" Lady Harrowfield demanded. Dr. Pembroke chose his words with precision. "Miss Clark is gravely ill. Her symptoms resemble—" He stopped himself, unwilling to speak the word into a room so determined to keep ugliness at bay. A disease often associated with contaminated water. Lord Harrowfield's expression hardened. "Impossible. We procure only the finest." Pembroke's fingers trembled as he opened his medical bag. "Illness does not observe class, my lord. It enters any home that unwittingly leaves the door ajar." "And the guests?" Lady Harrowfield whispered, her voice brittle. "Monitor them closely. Any fever, any stomach pain, notify me at once." He closed his bag with a sharp click, the sound echoing through the quiet room. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows, heavy, unyielding, a silent reminder that the world beyond their wealth still existed, still seeped through pipes and pumps and pitchers. Before leaving, Dr. Pembroke paused at the doorway. His voice was barely audible. "If I'm correct, this may be only the beginning." And when he stepped back into the morning mist, his hand trembled once more, not from the chill, but from the dread of knowing that whatever stalked the poorest corners of London had now slipped silently across the threshold of Belgravia. While the Harrowfields clung to composure and Dr. Pembroke retreated into his private worry, one person in the household had begun to fear the truth long before anyone else cared to acknowledge it. Violet Dawes, a maid of modest origin and unremarkable appearance, carried within her a secret instinct sharpened by a childhood spent in London's less forgiving quarters. She noticed things, small things, things that those above her rank never troubled themselves to see. It began 3 mornings before Miss Clark fell ill, when Violet went to fetch water from the kitchen pump. She worked the handle with practiced strength, expecting the usual clean gush. Instead, the water sputtered out with an odd heaviness, releasing a faint metallic scent that made her wrinkle her nose. It wasn't strong, barely perceptible, really, but it pricked at her memory. She had smelled something like it before, years ago, in a neighbour's flat where a sickness had swept through with cruel efficiency. She paused, letting the water run for several seconds, watching as it flowed into the copper pot. For a moment she thought she saw a cloudiness slight, but there. The cook barked at her to hurry, and Violet obeyed, setting aside her unease. After all, this was Belgravia. Such things did not happen here. But the next day, when she tasted a stray drop from the ladle before pouring it into the boiling kettle, the metallic tang lingered longer. She mentioned it to another maid, who dismissed it with a shrug. "The pipes are old, Vi. Don't trouble yourself." Then, lowering her voice to a whisper, "Besides, the mistress doesn't like us raising concerns, not about the water." So Violet said nothing more. But when Miss Clark collapsed, and when the guests from the dinner party began sending word of their own fevers, Violet felt her heart clench. She had known something was wrong. She had felt it in her bones. And with each passing hour, the dread grew heavier. She avoided the drawing room where Lady Harrowfield paced like a trapped bird. Instead, she made her way to the scullery, where Mr. Havisham was polishing silver with a vigour that suggested he wished to scrub away the entire situation. "Mr. Havisham," she whispered, glancing around to make sure no one else lingered nearby. I think the water might be the cause." The butler froze. The cloth halted mid-polish. His jaw tightened, though his voice remained even. "You must not speculate, Violet." "But I noticed." "You noticed nothing." His tone sharpened. "Do not repeat this idea to anyone, not the staff. Certainly not the family. Sir, if it's the water—" He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "If it is the water, Miss Dawes, then nothing you or I say will change what has already occurred, and speaking of it carelessly will only bring punishment for you, not for those who ordered its use." His eyes betrayed the fear he tried so hard to suppress. Violet swallowed, her courage wavering. She knew the rules of the household. Servants who caused distress were replaced without hesitation. Yet something in her insisted on being heard. "I think we should stop using it," she whispered. "At least boil it first, just in case." Mr. Havisham hesitated, a flicker of doubt crossing his face, but then he straightened, smoothing the front of his uniform. "We follow the mistress's orders. The water company has assured her there is no fault. That must suffice." Violet lowered her gaze. But inside her, a small rebellion stirred, a stubborn sense of duty, not to the family, but to anyone whose life might depend on the truth she recognized. That night, as she carried a fresh pitcher to the dining room, she paused in the corridor. The water sloshed against the glass, catching a thin shard of lamplight. She lifted the pitcher to her nose and inhaled. There it was again, metallic. Wrong. A shiver ran down her spine. She did not know the word typhoid. She did not need to. She knew danger when she smelled it. And she knew with a certainty that made her hands tremble that the Harrowfield home was no longer safe. Not for the family. Not for the servants. Not for anyone who drank from that shimmering, treacherous stream. The Harrowfield home, once a monument to quiet wealth, had begun to develop a strange new sound, barely noticeable at first, then impossible to ignore. It drifted through hallways lined with damask wallpaper, slipped beneath carved wooden doors, and threaded itself into the very fabric of the house. A cough, soft, dry, persistent. The sort of sound a polite person might stifle behind a gloved hand, hoping no one would notice. But in a Victorian household built upon the illusion of perfection, even the softest imperfection echoed like a crack in glass. It began with Cecily. She sat in the drawing room beside the tall window, her embroidery stretched taut across a ring. Sunlight filtered through lace curtains, scattering pale patterns across the floor. She paused mid-stitch, pressing a hand lightly to her chest. When she coughed just once, a gentle, almost apologetic sound, Lady Harrowfield glanced up sharply. "Have you caught a chill, darling?" "No, Mama," Cecily whispered, though her voice faltered. "Just a tickle." Lady Harrowfield frowned. She had not slept well. Worry pressed upon her like a hand. Miss Clark's fever had worsened overnight. The physician had returned briefly and left without offering any comfort. And now her daughter, her precious Cecily, coughed behind velvet curtains that were supposed to keep illness at bay. "Perhaps the air is dry," Lady Harrowfield murmured, as though hoping the problem could be folded neatly into something harmless. "I shall have the maid bring you a warm drink." But Cecily coughed again, slightly louder this time. A tremor of unease rippled through the room. From the hallway, Violet Dawes paused mid-step, the tray in her hands trembling. She knew that cough. Not personally, she had never allowed herself the luxury of illness, but she had heard it often enough in the cramped rooms of the poor, where clean water was a luxury and disease crept along the floorboards like a fog. It was the cough of someone whose fever had begun its quiet ascent. She hesitated, wanting to speak, wanting to warn. But Mr. Havisham's warning still echoed in her mind. You noticed nothing. So she lowered her gaze and passed silently into the room. "Your drink, Miss Cecily," she said, her voice so steady it surprised even her. Cecily smiled faintly, though colour had begun to bloom in her cheeks, a feverish rose, subtle yet unmistakable. Lord Harrowfield noticed it next. During a meeting in his study, he paused mid-sentence, a peculiar tightness settling in his throat. He coughed once, sharply, and pressed a handkerchief to his mouth. His business associate looked up with concern, but Lord Harrowfield waved the moment away. "Just overwork," he muttered. "Nothing more." But as the conversation continued, the cough returned, softer but insistent. It pressed at him like an unwelcome thought. By dusk, the cough echoed faintly through the house, a sound carried on polished floors and through curtained doorways. The servants exchanged worried glances. Mrs. Keene clutched her rosary. Even Mr. Havisham polished the silver with unusual fervour, as though he could banish illness by grace of elbow and cloth. The house felt altered, the air thicker, heavier, touched by something invisible. That night, Lady Harrowfield stood in the hallway outside Miss Clark's room, listening to the governess's fevered breathing. Behind her, she heard another cough, Cecily's drifting down the corridor like a fragile, haunting echo. A shiver traced her spine. "This cannot be happening," she whispered to herself. "Not here, not in our home." But illness cares nothing for upholstered chairs or gilded picture frames. It slips beneath doors, rests on linens, hides in the finest glassware. It waits, and somewhere downstairs, the crystal pitcher rinsed, dried, returned to its place, caught the glow of a gas lamp, and glittered coldly. As if pleased, as if patient, as if ready for the next throat it would set aflame with fever. Lady Harrowfield had always kept a diary, not a sentimental volume filled with confessions or flourishes, she was far too disciplined for that, but a small, leather-bound ledger of daily observations, kept with the same precision she applied to her household accounts. It was where she documented weather conditions, social appointments, menus for dinners, and the slightest misbehavior of servants. It was her quiet assurance that nothing within her world escaped her notice. But on the morning she opened it to write about Miss Clark's worsening fever, she found her hand trembling. She dipped her pen in ink and hesitated. The nib hovered above the page, leaving a single dark bead that threatened to fall. She exhaled slowly, willing her fingers to steady. Yet the tremor persisted, a faint but unmistakable quiver running from wrist to elbow. She blamed fatigue, stress, the late night spent listening to her daughter's restless cough. Then the pen slipped. A smear of ink streaked across the page, followed by a drop of moisture she could not blame on the pen. She lifted her hand to her forehead. Her skin felt warmer than it should in a house kept carefully temperate. A sheen of perspiration collected at her brow, and when she blinked, her vision wavered momentarily before sharpening again. She turned the diary toward the light. The page before her, meant for orderly script, now bore the first visible sign that something had invaded her disciplined world. A single oval stain, pale and damp, spreading slowly into the paper fibers. Lady Harrowfield swallowed hard. "It is nothing," she told herself. "A fleeting moment of weakness." But the doubt settled inside her like a seed dropped into fertile soil. The morning continued with a deceptive calm. Servants moved through the house with exaggerated quietness, as though noise might worsen the illnesses blooming behind closed doors. Miss Clark's fever had risen. Cecily coughed intermittently. Lord Harrowfield looked increasingly drawn, with a greyness beneath his eyes that his wife tried not to notice. Lady Harrowfield attempted to maintain the facade of control. She oversaw the table settings, instructed Mrs. Keene to sanitize the nursery, and penned a note to a friend who had written expressing concern about rumors from last night's dinner. But every task felt heavier, as though the weight of her hands had doubled. When she stood too quickly, the room swayed gently, like a ship at sea. She returned to her diary after luncheon, determined to finish the entry she had begun. Miss Clark's fever persists. The physician remains cautious. Cecily shows signs of a chill, though I believe it mild. Her pen dipped again, but this time her script grew increasingly unstable, letters leaning drunkenly, lines wavering. She blinked to clear her sight. A soft dizziness curled through her spine. She pressed a palm against the diary to steady herself. That was when she felt it, the unmistakable pulse of heat rising from her own skin, not the warmth of exertion, not the flush of embarrassment, but a deeper, insidious warmth, the kind that blooms quietly beneath the ribs and spreads outward with slow, deliberate certainty. She felt suddenly chilled despite the fever, a strange contradiction that tightened around her like silk pulled too taut. She dipped her pen once more, determined to regain composure. "I am, perhaps, overtired." The next word she attempted concerned never formed. Her vision blurred, the edges of the room dimmed, and the pen slipped again, dragging a long streak of ink across the lower half of the page. She gasped softly and reached for the nearby bell cord, but her hand faltered halfway. Instead, she lowered her head onto her forearms, the diary beneath her cheek. Her breath dampened the paper, leaving another spreading stain. A servant found her minutes later, slumped over her writing desk, her cheeks flushed with a fever that had already claimed others in the house. The diary remained open. 2 ink stains, 2 sweat stains, 2 warnings. The first belonged to Miss Clark. The second now belonged to the mistress of the house. And as the servant closed the diary with trembling fingers, it was clear. No ledger, no order, no discipline could chart the path of a disease that had already begun rewriting the Harrowfield family's fate line by fevered line. London's elite had long believed themselves immune to the earthly concerns that plagued the masses: foul water, unsanitary streets, the invisible illnesses that threaded through the city like dark seams. They lived above such things, perched atop polished horses, dressed in handsome riding coats, parading across Hyde Park with the confidence of people untouched by consequence. Or so they imagined. But rumours have a peculiar way of settling where arrogance resides, drifting softly at first, then taking root, like mould on damp wallpaper. At the Harrowfield Riding Club, an institution of impeccable pedigree, whispers had begun to circulate. It started the morning after the dinner party. The club, with its manicured grounds and spotless stables, was unusually subdued. A pale fog clung to the paddocks, softening the edges of the world, turning every rider into a ghostly silhouette moving through muted light. Horses snorted and stamped, exhaling plumes that mingled with the haze. Grooms exchanged uneasy glances. Something in the air felt off. Colonel Whitcomb, known for both his immaculate grooming and his staunch belief in propriety, arrived in unusually rumpled condition. As he dismounted, he paused to cough into a gloved hand, a dry, persistent sound that turned a few heads. "Chill this morning, Colonel?" asked Lord Pennington's friend, Mr. Berkeley, tightening the belt of his riding coat. The Colonel cleared his throat. A trifling irritation, nothing more. But the cough returned again as he adjusted his saddle. A deeper one, a rasp. Behind him, a groom made the sign of the cross subtly, quickly then pretended it was merely a stretch of stiff fingers. By the time the riders set off across the dew-drenched grass, the murmurs had begun. Lady Drayton, elegantly mounted on her black gelding, leaned toward her companion, lowering her voice. "Have you heard? Miss Everleigh took ill last night after dining at the Harrowfields." Her companion, Mrs. Ellingworth, stiffened. "Ill? In what manner?" "A fever, quite sudden, and Mr. Pennington as well. His wife sent word he cannot rise from bed." Mrs. Ellingworth's gloved hand tightened on the reins. "Surely it is coincidence." "Surely," Lady Drayton repeated, though her eyes betrayed doubt. "But the governess there is said to be gravely unwell." "What sort of illness?" Lady Drayton hesitated, lowering her voice further. "A common fever, they say." The way she said common carried the same dread as a curse. For the wealthy, the word did not mean ordinary. It meant dangerous. It meant shared with the poor, the greatest humiliation of all. The horses slowed to a trot as riders clustered together, their usual chatter replaced with subdued speculation. "I heard the physician is making daily calls," Mr. Berkeley said gravely. "I heard the household has taken to boiling linens," added a young lady whose mother had insisted she avoid strong smells, lest she appear unrefined. "I heard," Lady Drayton whispered, "that it may be contagious." A collective shiver ran through the group. No one said typhoid. No one dared. To name a disease so starkly associated with dirty water, slums, and overcrowded tenements would be to suggest the unthinkable, that the same invisible hand could reach into Belgravia's stately homes. But whispers do not need names to grow teeth. By midday, the rumors had settled like dust on every polished surface of the riding club. Stable boys refused to touch shared cups. One groom quietly scrubbed the pump handle with vinegar. Riders avoided lending gloves or brushes. Even the horses seemed restless, flicking their ears as though sensing the tension. And above it all, hovering like a spectre, was the name Harrowfield, not spoken aloud, not in polite company, but drifting through every corridor, layered beneath every worried glance. Even Colonel Whitcomb, who insisted on finishing his ride, was seen slumped over his horse on the journey home, his shoulders trembling with chills he tried desperately to ignore. By the end of the day, the rumors had reached a critical mass. Something was wrong in Belgravia, something that wealth could not shield against, something that might spread, and though no one dared say the words contaminated water, it hung in the air like an unspoken indictment. Meanwhile, in the Harrowfield home, the crystal pitcher sat washed and polished, waiting to be refilled. Waiting as rumors gathered strength like storm clouds. Waiting as the city began to turn its ear toward the quiet, growing panic. Waiting as illness continued to bloom behind velvet curtains. Mr. Havisham had always moved through the Harrowfield household with the poise of a pendulum, measured, steady, unerring. He was the axis upon which the daily rhythms turned, the quiet closing of doors, the precise timing of meals, the silent assurance that every detail remained as immaculate as the silver he polished. To the family, he was indispensable. To the servants, he was formidable. To himself, he was unbreakable. But even the strongest hinge cracks under the right pressure. It began with a chill. On an otherwise unremarkable morning, Havisham paused at the top of the staircase, laying a gloved hand against the banister. A shiver passed through him so abruptly that he steadied himself before taking the next step. He dismissed it. The fog had seeped into his bones, that was all. The early hour, perhaps. A draught. A missed breakfast. No matter, he had endured worse. Yet the chill persisted, threading its way through his spine like a thin, cold wire. He proceeded with his duties, though with slightly slower steps. He set out the silver trays, straightened the velvet drapery, supervised the washing of linens. Each task seemed heavier than usual, as if the air had thickened around him. By the time he reached the dining room to inspect the table, he found himself gripping the back of a chair to steady the tremor in his hands. "Are you quite well, Mr. Havisham?" Violet asked timidly as she entered with folded napkins. He straightened immediately, his dignity a shield. "Perfectly well," he replied with a curt nod. "You need not concern yourself." But he knew, and she suspected, that something was wrong. By midday, the fever had begun its silent ascent. Havisham retreated to the butler's pantry, sinking into a chair as a wave of heat washed over him. He removed his gloves, then his collar, his breath growing shallow. His vision wavered. The rows of polished glasses shimmered like ghosts in the dim light. He pressed a hand to his abdomen. Pain radiated outward in a slow, insidious bloom. He had seen similar symptoms before, not in Belgravia, but in the East End tenements where he had grown up, long before he remade himself into a man of refinement. Illness had stalked the poor like a hunter then. Dirty water, cramped quarters, contaminated pumps. But here, in a home where every surface shone, he closed his eyes. The water, he thought. He had known it had sensed something amiss since the first moment he saw that faint cloudiness, smelled that metallic tang. But he had adhered to decorum, to hierarchy, to the unspoken rule that servants must never alarm their betters. Now, as the fever tightened around him like an invisible vice, he realized the cost of his silence. By evening, his condition had worsened. Mrs. Keene found him slumped over the pantry table, drenched in sweat, his breaths shallow and ragged. She called for help at once. Together, Violet and 2 footmen carried him to a small guest room, one seldom used except for emergencies, and this, unmistakably, had become one. Dr. Pembroke was summoned again, though his expression, upon arrival, bore no optimism. "He's progressed farther than the others," the physician said, examining Havisham's flushed skin, his dry tongue, the tenderness in his abdomen. "His pulse is irregular, his fever dangerously high." "Is it the same illness as Miss Clark?" Mrs. Keene whispered. Dr. Pembroke hesitated, his voice tightening with the weight of unspoken truth. "It is similar." Havisham, barely conscious, stirred. His voice came as a fragile rasp. "The water, you must tell them. Stop drinking." But the words dissolved into a fit of coughing so violent that Violet rushed to steady him. He did not finish his warning. Havisham's decline was swift. Before dawn broke, he slipped into a restless delirium, muttering fragments of sentences, apologies, warnings, memories of childhood wells and contaminated pumps. The servants kept vigil in shifts, their faces drawn, their fear palpable. Violet sat beside him during the final hour, holding his hand despite the tremor in her own. When he exhaled his last breath, a shuddering sigh that seemed to empty the room of its remaining warmth, she felt the weight of truth settle upon her like a cloak. Someone would be the first to die. She had feared it. Now it had come to pass. But what struck her most was not the death itself, it was the silence that followed. No bells tolled, no mourning wreaths were placed, no words of grief were spoken upstairs. Because, in a Victorian home, the death of a servant was an inconvenience, and the hint of contagion was a scandal. Downstairs, Violet wept quietly. Upstairs, the family continued to cough behind closed doors, and the disease, now emboldened, continued its quiet march through the house, carrying with it the memory of the butler who saw the danger first, spoke too late, and paid the price no one else yet dared imagine. The letter arrived on a morning thick with gloom. The fog lay so heavily upon Belgravia that the chimneys seemed to float above a muted grey sea, their smoke curling like faint, uneasy whispers. The postboy, his cap pulled low against the damp, delivered the envelope with a perfunctory knock before slipping back into the mist, leaving Mrs. Keene to collect the morning's correspondence from the silver tray in the foyer. There, nestled between a bill for coal delivery and an invitation to a charity luncheon, lay a crisp envelope embossed with the seal of the West London Waterworks Company. Lady Harrowfield, pale and fatigued but attempting composure, broke the wax with trembling fingers. Inside was a neatly folded letter, its contents written in tidy copperplate script, the reassuring hand of an institution accustomed to quelling public unrest. "Madam, we acknowledge receipt of your inquiry regarding the recent concerns about the quality of our supplied water. Allow us to assure you that the water delivered to your district meets all established sanitary standards. There is no evidence whatsoever of contamination or impurity within the system. Any reports suggesting otherwise are unfounded or based on misunderstanding. Respectfully, the West London Waterworks Company." Lady Harrowfield exhaled, a weak sound meant to resemble relief. "You see," she murmured to her husband, who stood reading over her shoulder, "there is no cause for alarm. It is all rumour and exaggeration." Lord Harrowfield's face remained a mask of tension. "If that is the case," he replied carefully, "why do the illnesses multiply?" She did not answer. Instead, she folded the letter with desperate precision, smoothing the creases as though order on the page would impose order upon her life. Behind her, Cecily's soft cough echoed down the hallway, each delicate sound puncturing her fragile attempt at control. The letter was their last hope for denial, and she clutched it like a talisman. Downstairs, however, the servants were less convinced. Mrs. Keene read the copy of the letter aloud to the staff in the kitchen, though her voice wavered. Violet stood near the scullery door, her hands clenched in her apron. She had heard too many claims like this in her life, grand declarations from official bodies insisting that all was well while the poor sickened around them. "It can't be true," Violet whispered, half to herself, half to Mrs. Keene. Not with the way Mr. Havisham took ill, not with Miss Clark, not with the smell in the water. Mrs. Keene gave her a warning look. "Mind your tongue, girl. The mistress will not tolerate talk of contamination." "But what if it is the water?" Violet pressed softly. "What if they're lying?" The kitchen fell silent, because everyone, even those who served in wealthy homes, knew the truth. Water companies lied when it suited them. To admit fault meant admitting danger, and danger meant responsibility, and responsibility meant scandal. No company would willingly stain its reputation with the word disease if elegant phrasing could wash it away. The cook lowered her ladle into the pot and lifted it again. "There's a taste to it," she muttered. "Slight, metallic. I've been boiling it longer." "I've heard of this before," said the footman Thomas, voice low. "In my cousin's neighbourhood, they had letters like this. And then people died." No one dared finish the thought. Upstairs, Lady Harrowfield placed the letter prominently on her writing desk, where soft daylight touched its authoritative script. She imagined it as a shield, a barrier between her household and the growing dread that seeped through every corridor. But no letter could stop fever. No seal could stop contagion. And nothing written in elegant copperplate could silence the coughs echoing through the house, or the sound of Miss Clark's laboured breaths, or the memory of Mr. Havisham's trembling hand before he succumbed. By late afternoon, Cecily's fever had climbed. By evening, Lord Harrowfield could no longer ignore the tightness in his chest. And by nightfall, the reassuring letter lay untouched upon the desk, ignored now, as useless as a paper shield against a rising tide. Outside, the fog thickened once more, curling beneath doors and window frames, carrying with it the quiet, undeniable truth. No matter what the water company claimed, something deadly was already flowing through Belgravia, and the Harrowfields were no longer safely above it. They were drowning in it. In a society obsessed with refinement, nothing was more unthinkable, more insulting, even than the suggestion that wealthy Londoners should boil their water like the working poor. Yet that was precisely the whisper that began circulating one uneasy morning in Belgravia, riding on the steam from kitchen kettles and the fumes of coal fires burning low beneath iron stoves. It began with Dr. Pembroke. He arrived at the Harrowfield residence, wearing the same immaculate gloves, but with a different expression. Tired, strained, shadowed by sleepless contemplation. His visits had grown more frequent now, each one more urgent than the last. Miss Clark hovered in a fevered state between lucidity and delirium. Cecily's cough deepened. Lord Harrowfield's complexion paled into a troubling grey. Even Lady Harrowfield, clinging fiercely to denial, now displayed unmistakable signs of illness. "There is a precaution," the doctor said quietly, standing in the morning room beneath the heavy velvet drapes. "One I urge you to take." The family waited. Even the air seemed to lean closer. "You must boil your water," he said. A silence heavier than the fog outside settled across the room. Lady Harrowfield blinked slowly, as though struck. "Boil our water?" Her voice trembled with incredulity. "Doctor, that is a practice for the slums, not for respectable homes." "It is a practice," he replied evenly, "that may prevent further illness." Lord Harrowfield stiffened. "Are you implying our supply is contaminated?" "I am implying," Dr. Pembroke said carefully, "that caution is necessary. Your household is not the only one reporting similar symptoms." The words struck their pride like a blow. Lady Harrowfield rose abruptly. her hand pressing the side of the writing desk for support. "We received a letter from the waterworks company. They assured us there is no contamination." The doctor's mouth tightened. Companies often assure the public of safety when they have not yet examined the danger. That sentence, spoken so calmly, carried the weight of a scandal large enough to crack the porcelain veneer of Victorian civility. By afternoon, the rumour had escaped the Harrowfield home and begun coiling through Belgravia like smoke. "Boil your water." Servants whispered it first in kitchens, sculleries, and laundries. Then the tradesmen heard it. Then the stable boys. Then the maids who carried gossip between neighbouring houses like pollen on their aprons. Soon, one of Lady Harrowfield's closest acquaintances, Mrs. Pennington, whose husband lay sweating under blankets after the infamous dinner party, repeated the warning in her parlour with a trembling voice. Dr. Pembroke advised the Harrowfields to boil their water. Imagine, as though we lived in Whitechapel. Her guests gasped, fans snapping open like startled birds. "It suggests something dreadful," whispered one. "It suggests contamination," said another, barely above a breath. But the word carried a sting. Contamination meant filth. Filth meant uncleanliness. And uncleanliness, in Victorian society, clung to reputations long after illness passed. To admit the necessity of boiling water was to acknowledge vulnerability not just to disease, but to social ruin. By evening, the scandal had grown claws. Some households obeyed in secret, their servants quietly heating kettles behind closed doors. Others scoffed openly, claiming their water was pure enough to bathe in, let alone drink. Still others panicked, sending carriages to purchase imported mineral water at extortionate prices. But pride has always been the deadliest luxury. Lady Harrowfield stood in her marble kitchen, watching a pot boil furiously on the range. The steam rose in swirling coils, fogging the windows and her certainty alike. "This should not be necessary," she whispered, her voice cracking. Mrs. Keene dared not reply, because upstairs Cecily's fever had climbed yet again. And in the servants' quarters, Thomas now lay trembling with the same dreadful symptoms. And in the pantry, the crystal pitcher, polished, gleaming, innocent-looking, had been set aside at last, the water within it thrown out with shaking hands. Yet boiling water could not undo what had already been consumed. The illness had been invited in with silver spoons and crystal glasses. And now, despite every measure of refinement, it moved freely through the Harrowfield household. The scandal was not that the rich might become ill. The scandal was that they could no longer pretend they were safe. Outside, the fog pressed its forehead against the window pane like a mourner. Inside, the water hissed and churned, boiling away illusions that had lasted far too long. The bath was meant to soothe her. That was Lady Harrowfield's belief as she summoned Violet to prepare it a warm soak infused with lavender oil, poured into the deep rosewood tub imported years ago from Italy. A luxury, a comfort, a quiet refuge from the fevered whispers growing louder through the house. The tub, polished to a soft sheen, sat beneath a tall frosted window where the morning light filtered in as a pale, silvery blur. Lady Harrowfield leaned heavily against the doorframe as Violet filled the tub. Her breath trembled. Her fever, though she refused to name it, had begun its silent bloom behind her eyes. Her skin was flushed, her thoughts foggy, her pride clinging to its last threads of composure. "The heat will help," she murmured to herself. "It must help." Steam rose from the growing pool of water, carrying the sweet scent of lavender through the room. It curled around the carved wooden edges of the tub, around the porcelain bottles neatly aligned on the washstand, around the brass fixtures that gleamed in the dim light. Everything appeared elegant, serene. But beneath the surface of the water, something unseen stirred. Something that did not care for lavender or marble or rosewood. Something that thrived in the warmth Lady Harrowfield so desperately sought. Violet paused as she poured the final pitcher. The metallic tang reached her nose again, faint, but there. She had smelled it in the kitchen, in the pitcher, in the scullery basin, now in the bathtub. Her hands froze. "Ma'am, if I may," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. Lady Harrowfield lifted her head, her expression strained. "What is it, Violet?" "The water," Violet said cautiously. It doesn't smell right." The lady's eyes hardened, though even that firmness trembled beneath fever. "Nonsense. You are letting rumors cloud your judgment." She waved a hand dismissively. "Dr. Pembroke exaggerates. We are not savages in need of boiled water for every task." She sank onto the nearby chair, gripping the armrest, as a wave of dizziness washed over her. Violet opened her mouth again, but the words died on her tongue. A servant's objection could be mistaken for insolence, and insolence in that house earned consequences no fever could soften. So she bowed her head and stepped back. Lady Harrowfield disrobed slowly, her movements stiff with fatigue. She lowered herself into the bath, gasping as the heated water embraced her flushed skin. The heat, at first welcome, seemed to seep into her bones, into her lungs, into the pounding behind her temples. She closed her eyes, letting her head rest against the wooden rim. For a moment, she felt suspended, a body floating in perfumed warmth, disconnected from the coughing echoing down the hallways, from Miss Clark's delirious murmurs, from the physician's troubled eyes, from the water company's hollow assurances. But then the faint, creeping pressure in her abdomen returned sharper now, coiling inward. Her breath hitched. She shifted, clutching the side of the tub. The steam thickened, making it harder to draw breath. A bead of sweat rolled from her temple into the water. Then another. Then another. But they were indistinguishable from the ripples caused by her trembling hands. Downstairs, Mrs. Keene stood at the foot of the staircase listening for any sound. The house felt unnervingly quiet, as though the walls themselves waited. She clutched her rosary tighter. In the next room, Lord Harrowfield sat with a damp handkerchief pressed to his lips, his cough worsening, his pride eroding. He did not know his wife was bathing. He did not know what Violet had smelled. He did not know how swiftly the unseen contagion had woven itself through every luxury they possessed. All he knew was that his body, strong for so many years, now betrayed him with each ragged breath. Upstairs, the bathwater darkened slightly as the oils diffused across the surface. Lady Harrowfield tried to steady herself, but the dizziness grew thicker, as if the steam carried its own oppressive weight. She whispered, "Just fatigue," though no one was there to hear. Her fingers slipped from the tub's edge. Her vision wavered. The warmth that once felt soothing now wrapped around her like a tightening shroud. And beneath the scented surface, pristine, shimmering, and utterly deceptive, the very water she trusted continued its quiet work. The rosewood tub, imported with pride, cherished for its beauty, had become a cradle not of comfort, but of contamination. Another silent stage in the illness's relentless performance. Another room in the house where death practiced its lines. And as the bathwater lapped gently against the sides, Lady Harrowfield did not yet realize that the luxury meant to restore her would instead hasten her descent, the fever blooming beneath her skin as inexorably as steam rising from a tainted source. The nursery, once a sanctuary of soft colors and quiet joy, had grown strangely dim. Dawn filtered weakly through embroidered curtains, casting pale ribbons of light across the wooden floor. Toys lay untouched, dolls resting in their miniature chairs as though waiting for a playmate who had forgotten them. The air held a faint heaviness, not yet sorrow, but something leaning dangerously close. Cecily Harrowfield stood at the tall nursery window, her small hands pressed against the glass, her forehead resting lightly against the cold pane. Outside, the fog draped itself across the garden like a mourning veil. The roses carefully tended, each season appeared ghostly in the muted light. their petals blurred at the edges as though fading into nothingness. She watched the garden the way children sometimes watch the world when they do not yet understand fear but feel it anyway. Her breath fogged the glass in weak bursts. She lifted her hand to wipe it away, but her fingers trembled. Cough. Soft, but now unmistakably weighted. The sound broke the stillness like a thread snapping. Cecily's governess had always stood beside her during these quiet morning vigils, pointing out the birds perched on the iron fence or identifying the shapes of passing carriages through the mist. But Miss Clark now lay in a fevered haze in one of the guest rooms, her breath shallow, her skin burning. Cecily had asked after her the night before, but no one had offered comfort. Adults, she sensed, were far more frightened than she was. A shiver passed through her small frame. She wrapped her shawl tighter. But it was not the chill of the window that troubled her, it was the heat beneath her skin, creeping upward like water seeping through cloth. Downstairs, Lord Harrowfield's voice rose in agitation, a rare and desperate thing. "Where is the physician?" he demanded. "My daughter is unwell. My wife is weakening by the hour. Why has he not returned?" The butler would have answered. The butler was always the one to answer such questions. But the butler was gone now, taken by the same quiet violence blooming through the household. Mrs. Keene tried instead. "He is making his rounds, sir. Several homes have called for him this morning." Lord Harrowfield's eyes darkened. "Several?" But Mrs. Keene did not elaborate. She did not dare say that Violet had overheard 3 neighbouring households mention fevers of their own, that the grocer's wife had whispered of 2 families on the next street falling ill overnight, that what had begun in their own home now stretched its shadow beyond their doors. Upstairs, Cecily coughed again. The wet nurse, a mild woman named Hester, hurried to her. "Come away from the window, darling, you mustn't stand in the cold." "It's easier to breathe here," Cecily whispered. Hester's heart tightened. She touched Cecily's wrist. The skin beneath her fingertips radiated an unnatural warmth. The fever was rising. She bit her lip, fighting the urge to panic. She had seen this once before, long ago, in a crowded boarding house where a family of 7 had fallen ill one by one. She knew the look, the flush, the tremor, the way a child's eyes grew glassy, like marbles reflecting too much light. "Let's sit," Hester said gently. But Cecily swayed as she turned, her knees buckling. Hester caught her just in time, lowering her to the cushioned settee. Cecily's breath hitched, shallow, rapid. "Will Mama come?" Cecily asked weakly. Hester swallowed. "She's resting, my love." "Is Miss Clark better?" It was a cruel question, and innocence demanded no less than honesty wrapped in tenderness. "She is being cared for," Hester whispered, "and so will you be." Cecily closed her eyes, trusting the lie even as her little body trembled beneath the shawl. Downstairs, Dr. Pembroke finally arrived, breathless, dishevelled, his gloves askew. He went first to Lady Harrowfield, then to the nursery. When he entered, he paused. The sight of Cecily flushed, fragile, her curls damp against her temples, struck him with brutal clarity. Children, he knew, fell fastest. He knelt beside her, placing cool fingers on her wrist, then her abdomen. She winced. Her breath came in tight, shallow spurts. The tiny cough escaped her again, that thin, dreadful harbinger. Hester stood back, her face drained of colour. Dr. Pembroke inhaled unsteadily. His voice, when he spoke, was very soft. "The fever has reached her." Outside, the fog thickened. The roses blurred further. A crow landed on the garden wall, its call echoing through the muted morning air. And inside the Harrowfield nursery, the disease, quiet, efficient, merciless, laid its hand upon the youngest member of the house. The window pane chilled beneath Cecily's fading breath. Another cough bloomed. Another chapter of illness began. The house held its breath, waiting to see who would fall next. In Victorian London, tea was more than a beverage, it was ritual, refuge, reassurance, a fragrant pause in lives pressed tightly by etiquette and expectation. In the Harrowfield home, it was the one constant that had never faltered, no matter how turbulent the morning or how frayed the nerves. And so, on the day Cecily's fever deepened and Lady Harrowfield could no longer rise from her bed, Mrs. Keene commanded that tea be served in hopes of restoring some sense of order, however fragile. But comfort, like all illusions, can become a quietly sharpened blade. The kettle hissed on the iron stove, steam curling upward in ghostly tendrils. Violet stood watching the spout, her stomach tightening with each pulse of vapor. She had scrubbed that kettle twice already, inside and out, though no amount of scouring could cleanse the water that sloshed within it. She could smell it, that faint metal tang that coated the back of her throat whenever the steam reached her face. The boil water warning had spread through the servants' quarters like a wild, whispered flame. Yet boiling killed only some dangers. Others, those that lurked deeper, more cunning, more invisible, merely waited inside the steam, unfazed by heat. The kitchen door creaked open, and Mrs. Keene entered, her expression drawn and tired. "The mistress will take her tea upstairs," she said. "Strong, with lemon." "Yes, ma'am." Violet reached for the tea leaves. "And the master?" Mrs. Keene asked gently. The cook, stirring a pot at the far stove, answered first. "Still coughing, looks worse than yesterday." Mrs. Keene closed her eyes briefly. "Prepare a tray for him as well. Perhaps it will soothe him." Violet hesitated. "Ma'am, should we use the mineral water? The one Mr. Harrowfield purchased last night?" Mrs. Keene's brows drew together painfully. "We must conserve it. The doctor says they'll need it for drinking." The decision was made. The kettle remained where it was. Violet poured the boiling water onto the tea leaves, watching the amber color bloom. It should have been a comforting sight, rich, warm, familiar, but she felt only dread. Outside the kitchen window, the fog pressed against the glass like a shrouded spectator. She carried the first tray upstairs. Lady Harrowfield lay half upright against her pillows, her cheeks flushed with fever, her hair clinging in damp strands along her temples. The rosewood bath had drained her, not soothed her. Her skin now glowed with the telltale heat of a body waging war. "Your tea, madam," Violet whispered. Lady Harrowfield lifted the delicate porcelain cup with trembling fingers. The scent of lemon drifted upward, masking but not erasing the faint iron note rising with the steam. Violet lingered, torn between obedience and terror. "Shall I fetch the mineral water instead?" she ventured. A flash of irritation sparked in Lady Harrowfield's tired eyes. "Enough with these suspicions. The water is perfectly—" Her sentence broke into a cough. A deep one. A painful one. When it passed, she lifted the cup once more and drank. Violet's heart sank. Across the hall, Lord Harrowfield sat hunched in a brocade chair, his handkerchief stained, his breathing uneven. When Violet presented the second tray, he looked up with hollow eyes, the proud rigidity he once carried now replaced by quiet dread. "Thank you," he murmured, lifting the cup. His hands trembled so badly that some of the liquid sloshed over the rim. As he sipped, Violet felt the room constrict. She wanted to speak, to warn, to cry out, but she had already tried once, and the memory of Lady Harrowfield's rebuke still burned on her skin. She withdrew silently. Moments later, the first signs appeared. Lady Harrowfield felt it as a sharp twist beneath her ribs. Lord Harrowfield experienced a wave of nausea so sudden he nearly dropped the cup. Downstairs, the kettle whistled again, shrill, insistent, as though begging someone, anyone, to stop. But it was too late. Tea, that symbol of civility, calm, and control, had become yet another vessel of contamination. A polite disguise for a deadly visitor, slipping further into the family's blood. The Harrowfields clung to ritual, but ritual could not save them. Not from the water, not from the fever, not from the quiet death blooming beneath the porcelain surface of every sip. And as Violet washed the cups in the scullery sink, her hands shaking uncontrollably, she knew what no one upstairs wished to admit. The illness had ceased being an intruder. It now lived in the house, poured into its kettles, rested in its pipes, steeped in its tea, and with each breath, each cough, each trembling swallow, the Harrowfields unknowingly invited it deeper in. By midnight, the Harrowfield home had surrendered to a peculiar stillness, not the peaceful quiet of rest, but the heavy, suspended silence of a house waiting for something it cannot name. The walls, once proud with their brocaded coverings and gilt frames, now seemed to drink in the tension that seeped through every corridor. Dr. Pembroke arrived again long after the lamps had been dimmed. He stepped from his carriage with a weariness so profound it altered his usually immaculate posture. The fog had thickened, swallowing the street lamps until they appeared as faint, blurred halos floating in the night. His bag thumped softly against his leg as he climbed the steps, each footfall echoing like a warning. Mrs. Keene greeted him at the door with a trembling candle. Her voice cracked. "Doctor, they are worse." He nodded once, a solemn acknowledgement, then followed her upstairs, where the house breathed in fevered gasps. He examined Cecily first. The nursery felt stifling, warm with the heat of illness. The little girl lay curled beneath her blankets, her small frame trembling, her breath shallow. The faint flush of the previous day had deepened into a mottled rose that spread down her neck. When Dr. Pembroke touched her abdomen, she whimpered softly, her eyes barely opening. "She's weakening quickly," Hester whispered from the corner, clutching her apron. "Yes," the doctor murmured, his voice low. "Children often do." He felt the weight of the sentence as soon as it left his lips. Too heavy, too honest. Yet there was no taking it back. After murmuring instructions, he moved on. Lady Harrowfield's room was next. She lay propped against pillows, her skin burning, her breath uneven. Her once carefully kept hair clung in damp, tangled waves along her temples. When she spoke, her voice rasped. "Doctor, this is no ordinary fever." It wasn't a question. He sat beside her, checking her pulse. It skittered beneath his fingertips. "Your symptoms are consistent with—" He hesitated. The truth perched on his tongue like a bird ready to fly into a storm. "With an illness transmitted through contaminated water." Lady Harrowfield closed her eyes as if bracing for a lash. "They said our water was safe." "So the waterworks company claims," he replied softly. "Yet several households in your district are reporting similar fevers." Her eyes opened again wide, fearful, and for the first time, stripped of pride. "Are you saying, this is spreading?" "Yes." The word hung in the dim room like a tolling bell. Lord Harrowfield, normally a man of iron composure, now sat slumped in his chair by the hearth, coughing into a blood-tinged handkerchief. When Dr. Pembroke examined him, the physician's face grew even more grave. "You are worsening," he said quietly. Lord Harrowfield's jaw tightened. "Tell me plainly, what do we face?" The doctor exhaled slowly, a tired, defeated sound. He removed his spectacles, rubbing them with a trembling cloth. "Typhoid," he whispered. The word slipped into the room like a shadow, extinguishing what little hope remained. Lady Harrowfield stiffened, the colour drained from what fever had not already consumed. Hester clapped a hand over her mouth. Even the fire in the hearth seemed to shrink back in dread. Dr. Pembroke continued, his voice nearly breaking. "It is not yet certain, but the pattern, the abdominal pain, the fever, the rash, the exhaustion, and the cluster of cases all point toward it." Lord Harrowfield stared at the doctor, his expression hollow. "Typhoid is a disease of the slums." "No," Pembroke corrected gently. "Typhoid is a disease of water. Water does not distinguish between slum and mansion. A violent cough shook Lord Harrowfield's frame. Blood speckled the floor. The doctor reached for a cloth, but his hand froze. His glove had slipped. His fingers touched the contaminated handkerchief. He stared at his bare skin, pale under the lamplight, and a tremor passed through him. In that moment, he knew a terrible truth. Typhoid did not care that he was a physician. Typhoid did not care that he carried knowledge, or authority, or fear. Typhoid had touched him too. He looked up at Lord and Lady Harrowfield, his face drained of all pretense. "I must confess something," he said quietly. "The cases I visited before yours, the families, they are not improving. This is not a passing scare." He lowered his voice further, as though the house itself might recoil. "We are at the beginning of an outbreak." No one spoke. No one breathed. Somewhere downstairs, a teaspoon slipped from a servant's hand, hitting the tile with a faint metallic ring, the smallest sound, yet somehow carrying the weight of doom. Dr. Pembroke stood slowly, already feeling the fever's first soft whisper beneath his skin. Typhoid had entered the Harrowfield home, and now it had entered him. The ballroom had always been the heart of the Harrowfield residence, a vast chamber of polished oak, gilt mirrors, and crystal chandeliers that reflected the glow of gaslight in 1,000 fractured points. It was a place where laughter had once bounced against the high ceilings, where music soared from the grand piano and the harp in gentle harmony, and where the city's elite gathered to see and be seen. On this night, however, the room was not alive with sound. It had become an empty shell, haunted by the echo of a silent, invisible intruder. The Harrowfields had postponed the evening's planned dance at the last possible moment, under the guise of unforeseen household matters. Yet, word had already spread. Guests, who had arrived in their carriages, polished boots glinting, skirts swaying in elegant rhythm, were met not with music, but with a hushed, rigid air that pressed heavily upon them. Some coughed quietly, a nervous, polite cough intended to mask anxiety. Others whispered questions to one another, glancing about as though the chandeliers themselves might answer. Even the servants, whose usual composure had always been flawless, moved with a slow, uncertain cadence. Violet Dawes carried trays of tea and biscuits, hands trembling so that the porcelain threatened to slip from her grasp. Mrs. Keene hovered at the threshold, her eyes wide, a pale candle held before her, as though it could pierce the fog of fear creeping through the grand chamber. No one dared speak of the illness by name. To do so would be to invite scandal into the house, and yet the tension between acknowledgement and denial was nearly unbearable. Lady Harrowfield entered the ballroom briefly, her silk gown brushing the floor like a soft wind of elegance. Her face, normally composed and dignified, bore a sheen of sweat from fever and anxiety. She attempted a smile, a feeble signal of normalcy, but her eyes, glassy and wide, betrayed the truth. Something was wrong in her home. Something had penetrated the walls, slipped through the pipes, and now stalked every member of her family. "Perhaps the music will lift our spirits," she murmured to herself, though her voice carried no conviction. She reached toward the piano, running a trembling finger along its polished wood. But the thought of sitting at the keys, of producing the sound that had once filled the room with life, became unbearable. Instead, she sank into a chair at the edge of the room, pulling her shawl tightly about her shoulders. Dr. Pembroke arrived shortly thereafter, his presence marking the final fracture in the illusion of normalcy. He walked through the ballroom with measured steps, eyes scanning every face, every posture, every hint of pallor. He stopped near the center of the room, placing a gloved hand over his chest as he noted the subtle flushes and damp brows. He spoke softly, almost in a whisper. "It is progressing. The fever. It spreads easily, even within this household." A murmur passed among the assembled guests. Not fear exactly, more the recognition that the walls they relied upon for safety offered no protection. Those who had once believed themselves untouchable now understood that illness paid no heed to wealth, to pedigree, to grandeur. The chandeliers above flickered slightly as if responding to the mood, sending fractured patterns across the marbled floor. Footsteps echoed faintly against polished wood, each step amplifying the unease. Conversations had ceased entirely. The room seemed to hold its breath. Even the music, absent but remembered, hung like a ghost in the gilded mirrors. Violet moved among the guests with trays, but each porcelain cup she carried felt heavier than the last. Her hands shook visibly now, the tremor no longer hidden by the rituals of service. Mrs. Keene's pale candle flickered as if caught in a sudden draught, though the air was still. By the end of the hour, the ballroom was no longer a place of celebration. It had become a chamber of quiet dread, a testament to the power of what could not be seen. Guests departed with careful steps, casting anxious glances back at the golden mirrors, at the polished floors, at the empty corners where the disease might linger. And in the silence that followed, the room seemed to breathe, carrying with it the invisible footsteps of an intruder that had no respect for wealth, refinement, or prestige. The ballroom had fallen silent, and the Harrowfields, once masters of their domain, had learned that luxury could not stave off the quiet, relentless advance of death. In the drawing-room, Lady Harrowfield sat at her writing desk, the polished surface gleaming faintly beneath the soft glow of the gas lamp. Her quill hovered above a sheet of thick stationery, dipped carefully into the ink bottle that reflected her anxious face in its dark, viscous surface. Each stroke of the pen was deliberate, precise, as though the careful formation of letters could impose order upon a world that had begun to unravel. She was writing letters to friends and acquaintances, the ladies and gentlemen of Belgravia, and beyond, all the while feeling the fever beneath her skin like a slow-burning coal. The ink, dark and viscous, had been sanitized to the doctor's recommendation, boiled and filtered before use, yet the ritual of cleanliness offered little comfort. Even this simple task, a demonstration of control and civility, now felt suffused with dread. Every letter carried her hope that information could be contained, that the truth could be softened by careful phrasing and elegant script. "Dearest Miss Pennington," she began, her hand trembling slightly. "You will, I trust, excuse the delay in correspondence. Circumstances at Harrowfield House have been taxing." The word taxing hung over the page like a faint scent, chosen carefully to convey strain without specifying the horror that had claimed her household. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows with the persistence of a ghost, muffling the sound of carriage wheels on the cobbled street. It seemed to seep through the panes, curling into the corners of the room, making the polished mahogany panels appear damp and weary. Lady Harrowfield did not notice. Her attention was fully claimed by the quill in her hand and the words she forced onto the page, each a fragile barrier against the panic threatening to engulf her. She paused, laying the quill across the inkstand. Her wrist burned. The fever had grown, creeping steadily beneath her ribs, radiating into her fingers, into the thin muscles of her hand that now struggled to guide the delicate movements required for elegant script. She wiped her brow with a gloved hand, smudging a faint streak across the page. The mark was almost invisible, yet she saw it and felt its meaning: imperfection, weakness, vulnerability. "And still," she continued, "it is my hope that you and your family remain well, and that no illness troubles your household. Pray, accept my assurances that all measures have been taken to ensure the comfort and safety of those within our home." She paused again, reading over the lines. Words of comfort, polished and precise, yet entirely hollow. She could hear Miss Clark's cough echoing faintly from upstairs, and her own daughter, Cecily, stirring restlessly in the next room. The ink could not contain these realities, could not shield her friends or herself from the disease now moving invisibly through every corner of the house. Violet Dawes entered silently, bearing a tray with tea and a damp cloth. Her presence startled Lady Harrowfield, who grasped the letter and placed it atop the desk, as if to shield it from view. Violet, attuned to the subtle fever in her mistress, did not comment on the tremor in her hand or the flush creeping across her cheeks. She merely set the tray down and whispered, "Shall I fetch the mineral water, ma'am?" Lady Harrowfield shook her head. "No, the letters must be finished. The assurance of civility cannot wait." Her voice was low, strained, almost unfamiliar to herself. Each letter completed, carefully sealed with wax and stamped with the family crest, carried a veneer of composure to the outside world. They would speak of concern and precaution, but never of the tremor in her fingers, the heat in her skin, the invisible enemy coursing through her household. Each one was a fragile mask, a sanitized fiction written in sanitized ink. Yet beneath the polished script, beneath the carefully measured words, the truth persisted, indifferent to etiquette or reassurance. Fever, fear, and death were already in motion, threading silently through water, through pipes, through veins, beyond the reach of ink, beyond the reach of polite society. And as Lady Harrowfield leaned back in her chair, exhausted, she understood, with a dread that sank deep into her bones. The letters could not protect them. Nothing could. Violet Dawes had long learned the delicate art of invisibility within the Harrowfield household. A soft footstep, averted gaze, a whispered response that carried no weight, these were the tools of her survival. But now, as the fever crept through the family and servants alike, invisibility felt useless. Danger had a way of reaching even those who sought to remain unseen, and Violet knew that she alone, small and unnoticed, carried the faintest hope of preventing further tragedy. It began in the early hours of a misted morning, when the fog lay low upon Belgravia, curling around cobblestones like damp fingers. She had risen quietly, before the household awoke, with a plan so desperate it frightened her. In the corner of the scullery, behind the copper basins and the scrubbed shelves, she kept a bucket. A simple wooden vessel, ordinary, unremarkable, and, in her eyes, now a secret safeguard. She had filled it with water drawn from the first cold pump at dawn, a source that seemed marginally safer than the Harrowfields' main supply, which had already claimed victims. The metallic scent lingered faintly in her nostrils as she carried the bucket along the hallways, careful to avoid the creak of floorboards. Every door she passed was a barrier to the sick, to the oblivious, to the proud who believed themselves untouchable. And yet, the danger was real, pressing against the polished wood, hiding behind velvet curtains, resting in every glass, every silver kettle, every rosewood bath. She paused outside Miss Clark's room. The governess lay restless, murmuring unintelligible phrases between fevered breaths. Violet knelt silently beside the bed, lowering the bucket to the floor, the faint sound of its scrape against the polished wood echoing like a muted warning. She did not dare speak. The child's trembling body and flushed skin communicated more than words ever could. Next, she moved to the nursery, where Cecily slept fitfully. Her small chest rose and fell rapidly, each breath shallow. Violet set the bucket by the side of the crib, careful not to disturb the delicate linens. The girl's curls were damp with perspiration, her face painted with the subtle rose of fever. Violet's hands shook as she straightened a blanket, wishing desperately that her secret vessel could shield the child from the unseen hand reaching through the pipes and pitchers into their veins. Downstairs, the sound of muffled coughing rose from the drawing-room. Lady Harrowfield leaned against the back of a chair, her skin flushed, her eyes wide with the silent panic she refused to acknowledge. Lord Harrowfield coughed into a handkerchief, each effort leaving a trace of blood that spattered the fine carpet like a secret warning. The household seemed suspended between appearances and reality, decorum and disaster, oblivion and fear. Violet returned to the scullery, hiding the bucket behind the shelves once more, her heart hammering in her chest. The weight of secrecy pressed against her, the knowledge that she alone had perceived the water's subtle metallic tang, the signs that the Harrowfields themselves refused to see. And yet she also knew that her efforts might be futile. The fever had already spread too far. No hidden bucket could reverse what had begun in the crystal pitcher, the rosewood bath, the boiled teas, the glasses raised with naive confidence. She sank to the floor, pressing her forehead to the cool wood. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows, a dense, ghostly audience. Somewhere in the city, other households stirred, other servants whispered warnings, other waterborne dangers lingered unnoticed. And within the walls of the Harrowfield home, the unseen intruder continued its silent march. Violet clenched her fists. She would protect the children if she could. She would shield the innocent if she could. She would carry the secret of the hidden bucket through every corridor, every room, every echoing hall. Yet she understood, with a dawning, cold certainty, that even the best-laid precautions could not halt the fever that had already taken hold. The house had been breached. The enemy, invisible, patient, merciless, was already within. And no bucket, no skill, no obedience could undo what the poisoned water had begun. The streets of Belgravia lay cloaked in fog, the gaslights burning dimly against the chill night. London exhaled a damp breath, pressing the scent of coal and wet stone against the windows of every stately home, every narrow alley. The city was alive with the quiet, creeping anxiety of those who sensed something lurking in water, in pipes, in the very marrow of their world. And now, summoned by a flurry of whispered reports and unexplained fevers, a single figure moved through this fog with purpose, the city inspector, lantern in hand. Inspector Whitrow's boots echoed softly against the cobblestones as he made his way from house to house, the warm light from his lantern cutting through the grey mist like a blade. His eyes, sharp beneath the brim of his hat, flickered constantly, noting the faint metallic sheen on doorstep puddles, the unusual stillness of servants hurrying past, the shutters drawn more tightly than etiquette demanded. London had always been a city of secrets, but tonight the secrets bore a subtle, menacing weight. When he arrived at the Harrowfield estate, the inspector's steps slowed. The house loomed like a sentinel, its facade polished and elegant, yet oddly quiet. No carriage bells rang. No servants bustled in the courtyard. Only the faint creak of the iron gate and the damp sigh of the fog welcomed him. His lantern swung gently as he ascended the steps, illuminating the frost-darkened brass handles and the marble threshold. He knocked twice, each sound resonating like a question. Mrs. Keene appeared, her hands clutching a damp cloth, eyes wide with fear. "Inspector, you must understand. It is not as it should be," she whispered, leading him inside. The faint, coppery scent of illness clung to the hallways, mingling with lavender and wax polish in a disquieting perfume. Whitrow inhaled sharply, noting the weight of fear pressing down from the ornate ceilings. Upstairs, the inspector followed the head housekeeper to the nursery first. The child, Cecily, lay shivering beneath her blankets, her cheeks flushed with fever, her breaths quick and shallow. A faint cough escaped her, barely audible, yet sufficient to stiffen Whitrow's spine. He knelt beside her, lantern in hand, casting its golden halo across the small body. He could see it, the pallor beneath the rose-tinted cheeks, the tremor in her tiny fingers. "This is more than a simple fever," he murmured, turning to Mrs. Keene. "Have you noticed any patterns? Other households? Other rooms?" She nodded, her hands wringing her apron. "Yes, Miss Clark, ma'am. The master, even some of the guests. It spreads, I fear." Whitrow's gaze swept the room again. The polished toys, the embroidered curtains, the carefully stacked books, all now seemed trivial under the weight of sickness. He flicked his lantern toward the window. Fog pressed against the glass like a silent witness, carrying the promise of more contagion beyond the walls. He descended to inspect the water supply, carrying his lantern into the kitchen and scullery. Each basin, each copper pot, each gleaming tap was scrutinized. A faint metallic tang hovered in the air, subtle but undeniable. He noted the improper connections between pipes, the age of the main conduits, the proximity of waste channels to drinking water. The inspector's hand rested on his notebook, fingers trembling slightly as he scribbled meticulous observations. "This is serious," he said quietly, more to himself than anyone. "Not a single household in the district is safe while the system remains so compromised." The lamp's glow flickered against the walls, casting shadows that seemed to stretch and sway like the disease itself. The weight of invisible danger pressed into the inspector's chest. He had seen contamination before, in crowded tenements, in the riverfront districts, in the narrow, stinking streets of Whitechapel, but never here. Not in the refined, polished homes of Belgravia. He lifted his lantern once more, sweeping its light over the scullery floor, the polished cupboards, the gleaming silver trays, every surface a testament to human pride. Yet, in that glow, he saw the truth. Wealth could not protect from what moved silently through water. The disease had entered, and it would continue unless stopped. As he stepped back into the foggy street, lantern held high, Whitrow realized that the city itself was watching, and for the first time he feared that even the finest houses, the drawing rooms, the ballrooms, the rosewood baths, might not survive the invisible siege that had begun. The inspector's shadow stretched long across the cobbles, merging with the fog, a single witness to the creeping menace that had claimed the Harrowfield home and whispered its promise through the veins of the city itself. The Harrowfield household had grown quieter than any of the city's whispers could account for. Curtains remained drawn, gas lamps glimmered dimly through thickened glass, and even the servants moved as though treading on fragile eggshells, conscious that each breath might carry consequence. Yet despite the careful secrecy, word of death had already begun its inexorable journey through Belgravia. Mr. Havisham, the house's stalwart butler, had succumbed first his passing, leaving a hollow, tremulous silence in the polished corridors. Now, the news of the funeral, swift and hushed, had begun to stir unease in the district, carrying the faint scent of fear along with it. The funeral took place in the early morning, under a sky veiled by a stubborn mist. Carriages lined the curb outside the church, their polished wheels clicking softly against wet cobblestones. Pallbearers, dressed in the sombre precision expected of men of the service class, carried Mr. Havisham's coffin with careful hands. Yet even they moved with a subtle trepidation, aware that the illness which had claimed him had touched other houses, other families, and that a shadow of the same invisible menace followed them with every step. Inside, the church was dimly lit by flickering candles, their smoke curling in pale spirals toward the vaulted ceilings. The congregation, small, tightly clustered, composed of servants, and a few discreet members of the household whispered beneath their breaths. Their voices were muffled, the sound carrying a tension that seemed to press against the ancient pews. Even the priest, accustomed to guiding mourners through grief, delivered the service with a voice quieter than usual, as though speaking too loudly might rouse the spectre of disease hovering among them. Outside, the fog thickened, curling along the iron gates and spilling across the graves. London itself seemed to hold its breath. The streets, usually alive with the chatter of merchants and carriages, felt uncharacteristically vacant. Windows along Belgravia's terraces were shuttered, and faint silhouettes could be seen pressing faces against glass, watching the procession with the polite curiosity that veiled deeper dread. Mothers held children closer, Footmen paused mid-step, and the city, for a brief moment, acknowledged that even wealth and pedigree were powerless in the face of unseen illness. As the coffin was lowered into the grave, a muffled sob broke the silence. It was followed by another, then a third, all carefully controlled, though no less real for the restraint. The damp earth swallowed the first tangible victim of the Harrowfield household's ordeal, but the effect on the neighborhood was immediate. Rumors spread with the subtle speed of candle smoke. Illness had reached the rich. The disease did not pause at the gilded threshold. It crossed thresholds, indifferent, patient, unyielding. Lady Harrowfield, standing slightly apart with a handkerchief pressed to her lips, felt the weight of every eye, every whispered comment, every thought of fear that hung over the assembly. She remained outwardly composed, though inside her veins raced the knowledge that she and her family were vulnerable. The polished appearances of her home, the careful rituals of wealth, the assurances of water companies, all of it meant nothing now. The disease, silent and relentless, had claimed its first life in her house. Others would follow. The mourners returned to the city streets, casting anxious glances toward the Harrowfield residents as they passed. Conversation, when it began again, was hushed and cautious. Even the most refined members of the district spoke in low tones, mindful of ears that might overhear, aware that scandal, fear, and disease were intertwined in ways impossible to untangle. Inside the Harrowfield home, the windows seemed to absorb the mourning, and the walls seemed to tighten with the echoes of the coffin's lowering. The servants, pale and trembling, whispered in corners, their voices almost blending with the hush of the fog pressing against the panes. The house had lost its butler, the family had lost its assurance of safety, and the invisible intruder, patient, indifferent, unrelenting, continued its quiet advance, claiming corridors, bedrooms, drawing rooms, and the very breath of all within. The first life had been marked, the district had noticed, and the Harrowfields understood, with a dread that chilled more thoroughly than any fog, that the illness which had begun quietly in water, in pipes, in the gleaming crystal of a pitcher, would not rest until it had claimed them all, or until the city itself confronted the reality that wealth offered no sanctuary from death. Dr. Pembroke, exhausted from the relentless rounds of the Harrowfield household, finally convened with the city inspector in the dimly lit back office of the estate. Between them lay a map of Belgravia, its edges curling slightly from damp and age. The paper bore the faint brown stains of previous consultations, the ink slightly blurred where countless hands had traced boundaries, water lines, and conduits. On this map they plotted not streets or property lines, but shadows, the hidden veins through which water flowed beneath London's elegant facade, carrying a threat invisible to the untrained eye. Whitrow, the inspector, held a lantern aloft, its glow trembling across the folded map. Each street was a sinew, each pipe a vein. The city, with its gleaming facades and polished floors, was underlaid with a labyrinth of conduits and drains, old and precarious, many untouched since their installation decades prior. The Harrowfield's own water supply, drawn from these silent arteries, had already betrayed them. Here, Whitrow said, tracing a finger along a thickened line near the estate, is the main feed from the municipal reservoir. Notice the junctions corroded, poorly sealed. Any backflow or seepage could allow contamination from adjacent drains to enter the domestic supply. Dr. Pembroke leaned closer, adjusting his spectacles. "And here," he murmured, pointing to a faded red circle, "is the line that feeds the kitchen and nursery. Notice its proximity to the old sewer. A slight rupture, unnoticed, could have catastrophic effects." The inspector's hand lingered over the paper. "It is worse than we feared. Not just the Harrowfields, but multiple households along this route are at risk. If these conduits are compromised, the illness spreads silently, unobserved until the fever appears." Dr. Pembroke shivered slightly. "The disease has already taken hold within the estate. Miss Clark, Lady Harrowfield, Cecily, they are all symptomatic. The invisible enemy has found its way into every faucet, every basin, every pitcher. And, if it can reach the surrounding homes. Whitrow's lantern flickered, casting dancing shadows across the map. The city beneath them seemed alive, writhing in silence. They traced the veins through other districts, narrow alleys, hidden wells, forgotten pipes, a network designed for convenience and economy, yet now a conduit for calamity. The inspector shook his head. They will not see the danger. The rich will assume their fountains and cisterns, polished and gleaming, are impervious. But water does not respect wealth. Nor glass, nor marble, nor pipe can prevent the march of what we cannot see. Dr. Pembroke ran a trembling finger along the line, feeding the nursery, noting the proximity to the old gardens, the cisterns that collected runoff, the minor cracks in the masonry that had been neglected for decades. He remembered Violet's whispered observations, the metallic tang she had noticed, the hidden bucket she had prepared in vain. The servants, diligent but powerless, were now unwitting participants in a silent siege. They cannot comprehend it, the doctor said, almost to himself. They will blame servants, the fog, the city itself, anything but the hidden menace beneath their feet. Whitrow folded the map slightly, as though to conceal the horror it revealed. "We must move quickly," he said. "Isolation, boiling, strict monitoring. If we fail, the disease will spread unchecked through these veins, reaching every household that drinks from them." The doctor nodded, but a chill ran through him. He had treated fevered patients in the East End, in overcrowded slums, among families who lived hand to mouth. But never before had he confronted wealth so defiled by the same simple, merciless mechanism, water. The very arteries designed to supply comfort had become instruments of death. Together they left the back office, lanterns flickering against the polished walls, aware that beneath the elegant floors, beneath the rosewood panels, beneath the marble and silver, London's veins carried shadows darker than any fog. The map of underground shadows revealed not just a network of pipes, but the fragile illusion of security itself, one already fractured, one that might never recover. And in that silence, heavy with anticipation, they both understood. The invisible enemy had claimed not only the Harrowfields but the city itself. The Harrowfield garden, once a place of genteel leisure, of trimmed hedges and sculpted flower beds, now carried an air of dread. Dawn broke through a persistent mist, casting the dew-laden lawns in a pallid light that seemed almost spectral. Every blade of grass, every droplet on the rose petals, trembled under the weight of an invisible menace, a presence no one dared name aloud. The heart of this menace lay hidden, concealed beneath the surface of a structure meant for sustenance and serenity, the old well at the far corner of the estate. Violet Dawes approached it cautiously, basket of towels clutched to her chest. She had noticed the subtle change in its waters the previous evening, the faint metallic tang that rose with the morning steam. At first, she thought it a trick of her imagination, a product of the candlelight and fatigue. But as the fever spread through the house, claiming servants and family alike, she understood the truth. The well, once trusted, had become a silent accomplice in the household's decline. The stone surround was slick with moss and dew, the cast-iron pulley rusted in faint streaks of orange that caught the early light. Violet knelt, lowering her hand cautiously to the surface of the water. It rippled under her touch, the reflection of the grey sky fractured in trembling lines. The metallic scent rose again, faint but unmistakable, curling into her nostrils like a warning whispered too late. She recoiled, fingers trembling, heart hammering. Here, in this well, lay the unseen harbinger of illness that had already penetrated every faucet, every kettle, every crystal pitcher in the house. She had considered drawing the water for boiling, for purification, but hesitation had paralyzed her. The Harrowfields were unaware. Their routines, their pride, Their faith in wealth and sanitation had blinded them to the peril beneath their feet. The servants had begun to whisper about the metallic tang, the faint cloudiness, but they were too timid to act openly, lest their warnings provoke disbelief or worse, reproach. And so the danger persisted, quietly, patient, unrelenting. Violet drew back, basket in hand, and glanced over her shoulder. The fog pressed against the edges of the garden, thick and suffocating. The distant sound of carriage wheels echoed along the street beyond the gates, punctuated by the soft clatter of an early-footed neighbor walking through the mist. Within the estate, the house was still. The Harrowfields slept or lay fevered, as she knew from the hushed conversations that crept along servant corridors. The well's water, calm and unassuming, held the power of ruin. It had already betrayed them. Miss Clark, Lady Harrowfield, and Cecily were symptomatic. Even Lord Harrowfield had shown early signs of malaise, and the servants, though diligent, were not immune. The source was clear and horrifyingly simple. The well, once a symbol of domestic comfort, had become a cradle for disease, its innocence turned traitorous. Violet returned to the house, careful to avoid the slightest noise. She kept the secret close to her chest, aware that knowledge alone was both weapon and burden. The well remained untouched, its waters untouched, and yet, through the house, its invisible reach continued. It had already seeped into the crystal pitchers, the rosewood baths, the polished kettles, and the glasses raised in polite defiance of danger. She paused at the top of the staircase, listening to the soft, uneven breathing of those asleep or fevered in their rooms. The house exhaled, thick with quiet dread. The disease was patient. The well had provided it entry, and the Harrowfields, like the city beyond their gates, had yet to comprehend the depth of their vulnerability. Outside, the mist thickened around the stone well. The iron pulley, blackened and cold, seemed to watch, silent and indifferent, as though pleased by the invisible threat it had delivered. The well waited, and so did the illness, moving with the inevitability of shadow across polished floors, down velvet-draped corridors, into every chamber, claiming, slowly but relentlessly, those who had believed themselves above harm. The servants' quarters, perched at the rear of the Harrowfield estate, had always been a place of quiet efficiency. Narrow corridors, polished wooden floors worn smooth by decades of footsteps, and small, orderly rooms had once been sufficient to contain the rhythms of a household running like clockwork. Now, however, the quarters had become the epicenter of unease, a microcosm of the invisible plague that had infiltrated every corner of the estate. The disease had no regard for rank or refinement. It found its way first into those whose lives were closest to the conduits of service, the very veins through which the household depended upon their labor. Violet Dawes moved through the narrow passageways with careful steps, carrying a bucket of water from the first morning draw. The metallic scent lingered faintly in the air, like a ghost teasing the senses, and she could not ignore it. She had learned to notice the smallest changes, the subtle cough suppressed behind a gloved hand, the tremor in a wrist polished by years of service, the pallor creeping across cheeks once robust with health. Each sign was a warning, a signal that the illness had claimed ground in rooms that had long been ignored by the wealthy who relied upon them. In the first room, Thomas, the young footman, lay shivering beneath a thin blanket. His breath came in short, rapid bursts, his pulse racing. Violet knelt beside him, pressing a cool cloth to his brow, though it did little to abate the heat radiating from his body. He had been among the first to handle the water drawn from the estate's compromised sources, pitchers, basins, kettles, each a silent vector of the unseen enemy. The fever had found him swiftly. Down the corridor, Margaret, a laundress of quiet disposition, coughed softly into her apron. She had worked late into the night, laundering linens saturated with the sweat, water, and secrets of the household. The disease had followed her, invisible, patient, unyielding. Her eyes, usually composed and gentle, were glassy with fever, and the tremor in her hands threatened to spill the carefully folded clothes she had just removed from the drying racks. The quarters themselves seemed to carry the weight of sickness. Walls that had once reflected the warmth of oil lamps now seemed oppressive, their timbers groaning beneath the tension that had infiltrated every corner. Windows, small and often shuttered, failed to provide more than a token breath of air, insufficient to disperse the invisible threat. Even the faint scent of lavender and soap, once relied upon as a shield against decay, had no power here. Violet moved between the rooms, attending to those in her charge, carrying buckets of water to dilute the tainted supply, boiling what she could, washing what could be washed, attempting to impose order against chaos. But with every step, the disease seemed to anticipate her efforts, moving faster than she could counter, claiming yet another servant whose vitality had already been weakened by exhaustion and fear. By mid-morning, the quarters had become a chamber of quiet terror. Whispered warnings, faint coughs, shivering bodies, and the pallor of those too ill to rise created a tapestry of dread. The invisible enemy had transformed a space of labor and obedience into a theater of suffering, and within it, the servants bore the brunt of a disease whose true reach extended well beyond their walls. Violet paused in the narrow corridor, glancing at the small rooms stretching away from her. Each door, each shuttered window, held another story of creeping fever and quiet terror. She pressed a hand to her chest, feeling the pulse of her own anxiety, and understood the servants' quarters, modest and unnoticed by the wealthy who depended upon them, were now the epicenter of an illness that respected no boundaries of class, comfort, or pride. And in that realization, she knew the inevitable truth. Unless something changed, the invisible plague would march from these narrow halls into every polished room, every gilded corridor, every crystal pitcher, claiming all who dwelled within the Harrowfield estate. Lady Harrowfield sat at her dressing table, the soft morning light through the lace curtains doing little to pierce the haze of her thoughts. Her reflection stared back at her from the polished mirror, pale, flushed, and yet determined, as if the careful arrangement of hair and corset could conceal both the fever within her veins and the dread that had settled over the household like a damp shroud. She would not, could not acknowledge the truth that had begun to unfold around her. Illness, contagion, fever, death. These were notions suitable for servants, for the East End, for those who lived without the shields of wealth and pedigree. But in her house, in her carefully maintained world, such things had no place. She brushed her hair with deliberate care, each stroke a mantra, a ritual, a talisman against the encroaching despair. She tried to convince herself that the coughs echoing from the nursery, the shivering of servants in the quarters, even the tremor in her own hands, were the results of fatigue, the fog pressing into the walls, the exhaustion of managing a large estate. Denial was a discipline, and she had practiced it all her life. She had summoned composure in the face of financial strain, social embarrassment, and domestic mishaps. Why not now, in the shadow of disease? Violet Dawes entered quietly, carrying a tray with tea. She moved with the discretion of someone accustomed to invisibility, but her eyes betrayed the fear she had seen in every crevice of the house. Lady Harrowfield forced a smile, though it felt brittle and foreign. "Place it here, Violet," she said softly, pointing to the side table. "It will do me good." The girl obeyed, setting down the porcelain with trembling hands, careful not to jostle the cup. She dared not speak of the metallic tang she had noticed in the water, or the hidden bucket she had prepared in secret, or the fevered bodies she had tended in the servants' quarters. Knowledge in this house carried danger, the danger of provoking disbelief, panic, or worse, accusation. Lady Harrowfield lifted the cup with a delicate hand, inhaling the faint scent of bergamot. She sipped carefully, feeling the heat of the tea mingle with the fever burning beneath her skin. She told herself that this was precaution, not indulgence, that warmth and civility would hold the disease at bay, that her body, shielded by strength and will, could resist what had already claimed servants and the governess. Yet, even as she spoke silently to herself, a faint, insistent cough drifted from the nursery, echoing through the polished corridors. Cecily's small body trembled under its blankets, and Lady Harrowfield felt a pang of fear she could not entirely suppress. She pressed a gloved hand to her mouth and forced herself to swallow both the tea and the rising panic. Denial was armor, she reminded herself. Armor was everything. Downstairs, Lord Harrowfield coughed into a handkerchief, his pulse rapid, his colour uneven. The household moved with hushed urgency, servants bustling quietly, each step measured, each whisper controlled. All were aware, though none dared speak, that the disease had infiltrated walls and pipes, that it flowed through water and air, invisible and indifferent. But Lady Harrowfield remained resolute, her denial a fragile lattice that she hoped would hold the weight of reality at bay. She rose from her chair and moved to the window, pressing her hands against the cool glass. Outside, fog pressed low across the garden, curling around rose bushes and statues like a shroud. She looked toward the well in the far corner, aware, in some hidden corner of her mind, that the water was suspect, yet refusing to grant the thought space to breathe. To acknowledge it would be to admit vulnerability, and in her world, vulnerability was unthinkable. With a final, deliberate sip of her tea, Lady Harrowfield straightened her shoulders and forced a smile at her reflection. Her reflection returned it, pale and strained, but obedient. Denial, she decided, was the only shield left. And behind every velvet curtain, down every polished corridor, in every pipe, every kettle, and every crystal glass, the fever waited patient, invisible, and unrelenting to see how long her denial could withstand it. The gleam of polished brass had once been a source of quiet pride in the Harrowfield estate. Every fixture, from the tall, arched faucets in the kitchens to the delicate taps of the servants' basins, reflected the wealth and taste of the household, each one a symbol of refinement and order. Yet that same gleam now seemed to mock them, the golden shine belying the danger that lurked within. For beneath the gleaming surfaces, beneath the very metal that promised purity, flowed water that carried disease as surely as ink flows from a poisoned quill. Violet Dawes approached the kitchen faucet with a sense of trepidation she had not previously known. Her fingers brushed the polished brass as she turned the handle, and the metallic tang she had smelled days before rose faintly once more. It was subtle, easily dismissed, yet she could no longer ignore it. She had seen the fever spread, had felt its heat brush against her own palms as she tended to Miss Clark and the children. She knew that the golden faucets were conduits, not barriers, and that each pour brought the invisible intruder one step closer to claim. She dipped a ladle into the flowing water and let it fall into the copper pot below, watching the ripples disturb the surface. The sheen of the brass reflected back, distorted by the movement, as though the fixture itself wavered under the weight of its guilt. The faucet, so carefully polished, so carefully maintained, had betrayed them all. The servants, trained to uphold the dignity of wealth, were now the first witnesses to its treachery. Upstairs, Lady Harrowfield reclined against the rosewood armchair, fanning herself with a delicate hand. Her skin was flushed, her pulse hurried, yet her expression remained composed, though fragile. The fever that had begun with Miss Clark and spread to the servants had now touched her as well, though she would not admit it aloud. Every sip of water, every glance at the gleaming fixtures, carried a reminder of vulnerability she refused to acknowledge. To do so would be to concede that wealth and elegance offered no protection against the invisible hand moving through their home. Lord Harrowfield, seated at the dining table, clutched a handkerchief to his lips, his breathing uneven. Even he, proud and accustomed to control, could not escape the relentless advance of the disease. The golden faucets, the porcelain pitchers, the crystal glasses, all had become instruments of the illness, silent accomplices in its inexorable spread. Violet moved between the kitchens and sculleries, boiling what she could, pouring cautiously into basins, trying to safeguard the children and the feeblest of the servants. Each movement was measured, precise, as though a misstep could hasten the inevitable. She thought of Mr. Havisham, of Miss Clark, of the small hands of Cecily trembling in the nursery. Each one had tasted, unknowingly, the treachery hidden in the very fixtures meant to provide life and comfort. The city outside remained indifferent, fog curling along the streets, pressing against windows, hiding the distant footsteps of neighbours and the faint glimmer of lanterns carried by watchmen. The Harrowfield estate, so insulated by wealth and civility, was now a stage upon which the disease acted with merciless precision. Every golden faucet gleamed with silent accusation, each drop of water a whisper of the inevitability that awaited them. By evening, the household had grown still. The servants whispered quietly, trying to preserve what dignity remained. The children were feverish, the adults pale and tense. Even the polished brass of the faucets seemed to sag under the weight of their guilt, as though the metal itself mourned the complicity in the silent, invisible murder coursing through the veins of the house. And yet, in every reflection, every droplet, and every carefully maintained surface, the truth remained. The golden faucets were not pure. They were conduits, they were traitors, and they would continue to pour death into a home that believed itself untouchable. The Harrowfields had learned, far too late, that wealth and refinement offered no sanctuary from the invisible, patient, and unrelenting enemy that flowed through water, through pipes, and through every golden fixture in their grand home. The nurse's journal lay open on a small table in the servants' quarters, its pages curled and worn from fevered hands and hurried entries. Each word bore the weight of exhaustion, each line a record of suffering and observation that no one above the household's polished ceilings would ever see. Miss Clark had been her first patient, the fevered governess whose pallor had been masked by an orderly demeanour, whose body now writhed under the invisible siege that coursed through every faucet, every pitcher, every polished surface of the Harrowfield estate. Hester's handwriting wavered across the page, jagged and hurried. Miss Clark's temperature rose sharply before dawn. She murmurs incoherently, "I dare not leave her side." The others are now showing signs: fever, flush, shivering. Lord and Lady Harrowfield are pale, distracted, the children restless. The servants whisper, afraid to speak. Her ink smudged in places where her fingers had been slick with sweat, each smear a testament to the frantic care and dread she bore. The nurse's candle flickered, casting tall, quivering shadows across the walls of the cramped quarters. The room smelled faintly of lavender, soap, and sickness, a mixture that clung to Hester's lungs and did not release. She hunched over the journal, quill poised, compelled to record every detail before the moment slipped into fevered chaos. The disease moved swiftly, invisibly, its patterns mapped only in whispered observations, in the trembling of hands, in the quiet groans that echoed from the rooms beyond. She wrote of Violet Dawes first, the housemaid whose vigilance had become a faint bulwark against disaster. Violet noticed the metallic tang in the water before I did. She prepared a bucket in secret, though the household would not heed her warnings. Her hands shake now as she moves from room to room, attending the fevered, yet she is steady where I am not. Hester's own hands trembled slightly as she inscribed the words. She paused, pressing a hand to her forehead, feeling the heat crawling beneath her skin. Fatigue and fear coiled together, unrelenting. She detailed the children next. Cecily, restless and flushed, coughing softly behind the nursery curtains, her tiny body already strained by fever. She wrote of the golden faucets, once symbols of purity, now conduits for the disease. and of Lady Harrowfield, poised in denial, who sipped cautiously from her porcelain cups while the invisible intruder reached deeper into the household. Even Lord Harrowfield, proud and stoic, was not spared. His coughs were deeper now, his face pale beneath the gaslight, each breath a struggle. Hester recorded the servant's suffering with meticulous care. Each symptom, each fevered pulse, each shiver was noted as though the pages themselves might serve as evidence against the indifference of wealth. The scullery smells of fear and faint iron, the laundry rooms are lined with linens, damp with sweat and worry. No one speaks openly. The disease has claimed the first of us, and I fear the next will follow. The candle guttered, casting elongated shadows across the walls. Outside, the fog pressed against the windowpanes, thick and unyielding. Hester shivered, not from cold, but from the knowledge that what she recorded in ink would remain a secret, unseen and unheeded by those above. The golden fixtures gleamed, the rosewood baths shimmered, the crystal pitchers lay polished and inviting, yet all were instruments of betrayal. She paused to dip her quill again, heart racing. Her pulse mirrored the rhythm of the household, uneven, frantic, caught between hope and despair. We are the first line of witnesses. We see what is unseen. We touch what is untouchable. And still, the disease moves through this house, relentless, patient, indifferent. I fear for all of us, but I must write, for if no one reads these words, at least they bear witness. Hester leaned back, exhausted, candle smoke curling around her like the fog in the streets below. The journal lay open, a fragile testament to the invisible battle waging within the polished walls. In the silent quarters, where servants feared both the sickness and the wrath of the wealthy, the dying nurse wrote on, chronicling a household unraveling under the merciless advance of an unseen enemy, and recording, in trembling ink, the first, unmistakable signs of catastrophe. The copper pot rested on the iron stove, its surface gleaming faintly beneath the flickering light of the kitchen lamp. It had once been an instrument of comfort, a vessel to bring warmth and nourishment to the Harrowfield household, but now it had become a conduit of dread. The water inside shimmered with an innocence it no longer possessed. It had been drawn from the estate's tainted supply, boiled and poured, yet still harbored the invisible enemy that had claimed so many before it. Violet Dawes approached with trembling hands, the tray in her grasp quivering under the weight of both porcelain and apprehension. She had seen the fever spread, had tended the sick, had borne witness to the tremors in Miss Clark's hands, the flush on Cecily's cheeks, the pallor of Lady Harrowfield's skin. The copper pot, polished and shining, had already served its purpose in the quiet destruction, and now she was to carry it to the nursery, to deliver sustenance that might be more curse than comfort. The kitchen was heavy with the scent of boiling water mingled with soap, wax, and faint iron. The air seemed to press against her lungs, thick with anticipation, as if the very room had become conscious of its role in the unfolding tragedy. Servants whispered quietly among themselves, moving with measured steps, their eyes cast downward, unwilling to meet one another's gaze. They knew, as she did, that each sip, each pour, each careless contact with the copper vessel could bring the disease closer, yet their duty compelled them onward. Violet lifted the lid, a thin wisp of steam rising, carrying with it the faint metallic tang that had haunted her since the first morning draw. She paused, hand on the handle, heart hammering in her chest. Every instinct told her to halt, to run, to warn, yet the household depended on her, even as it imperiled her. She dipped a ladle into the water, letting it flow into the waiting cups and basins, with the care of one performing a ritual rather than a simple task. Each drop was measured, precise, deliberate. Upstairs, the nursery lay dim and quiet. Cecily, fevered and restless, stirred beneath her blankets. The child's small body writhed slightly as Violet entered, carrying the tray with the copper pot at its center. The faint glimmer of the metal caught in the candlelight, and for a moment Violet imagined the vessel as a predator, patient and unrelenting, ready to extend its reach through porcelain and glass into veins unprepared for the invisible threat. She set the tray on the small table beside the crib, carefully ladling water into the child's cup. Cecily's lips, fever-dry, trembled as she accepted it, and Violet could not help but flinch at the thought that every sip might carry harm instead of relief. Her hands shook despite every effort to steady them, and the soft rustle of fabric as she adjusted the blankets seemed impossibly loud in the hushed nursery. Behind her, the house exhaled in silence. Lady Harrowfield, propped against pillows in the drawing-room, felt a faint tightening in her chest, though she would not acknowledge it. Lord Harrowfield coughed quietly in the library, blotting his handkerchief as the tremors of the fever crept along his arms. Miss Clark murmured deliriously in her bed, the rise and fall of her fevered breath echoing faintly through the halls. The copper pot, polished and gleaming, remained at the center of it all. Innocuous in appearance, it had become a vessel of peril, a quiet participant in the spread of the invisible hand moving through the household. It shimmered in the dim light, as if aware of its own agency, patient, indifferent, unyielding. Violet stepped back, hands folded tightly over her apron, watching Cecily sip from the cup. She whispered a silent prayer, not for the water, not for herself, but for the children, for the servants, for the household that teetered on the edge of devastation. Every movement, every thought, every breath in the room was heavy with anticipation. And as the child set down the cup, the copper pot gleamed once more, as polished, as innocent, and as deadly as the day it had first been filled. The disease had claimed its conduit, and in the Harrowfield household, the copper pot's silent work was only beginning. The drawing-room, usually a theatre of genteel conversation and polite laughter, had transformed into a chamber of hushed urgency. Lady Harrowfield sat rigid in her rosewood armchair, the gold-trimmed velvet pressing against her fevered skin, while Lord Harrowfield paced the polished floor, the soles of his shoes scuffing faintly against the parquet. Behind them, the heavy velvet curtains were drawn tight, sealing the room from the fog pressing along the street outside. The household's most trusted servants, Violet, Mrs. Keene, and a few key attendants, hovered near the walls, shadows within shadows, bearing witness to a meeting charged with unspoken dread. Dr. Pembroke had arrived once more, his presence a mixture of authority and foreboding. He carried no instruments, only his medical bag, and the weight of knowledge too heavy to share fully in the light of day. He stood near the hearth, its embers casting a wavering glow across his face, accentuating the lines of exhaustion and the faint pallor that now mirrored that of his patients. His eyes flickered from Lady Harrowfield to Lord Harrowfield, then to the silent attendants, before finally settling on the ledger. He had carried a record of symptoms, patterns, and observations meticulously noted in ink, now smudged with the sweat of fevered hands. "My lord, my lady," he began, voice low and deliberate, "the illness spreading through your household is unlike any ordinary fever. It is waterborne, insidious, and indiscriminate. The patterns suggest contamination in your primary water supply, and unless immediate action is taken, it will continue to claim victims." Lady Harrowfield pressed a gloved hand to her forehead, the skin beneath damp with heat. "Doctor, are you suggesting that the house itself is unsafe?" Her voice trembled, betraying the thin veneer of composure she had maintained. "Yes," Dr. Pembroke replied without hesitation. "The water, the taps, the pitchers, even the kettles, all have been exposed. Each use is a potential transmission. The disease does not observe status or rank. It moves silently, patiently, through those it touches." Lord Harrowfield stopped mid-stride, his gaze fixed on the polished floorboards, as if the truth could be blotted from the room by mere will. "And the children?" he asked, voice nearly inaudible. "Are they—" The doctor's eyes darkened. "They are vulnerable. The governess, Miss Clark, has already succumbed. Cecily's symptoms are rising. Lady Harrowfield herself shows early signs. The servants are not immune. This is a household-wide threat." A heavy silence fell over the room. Even the crackling of the fire seemed subdued, as if the hearth itself recognized the gravity of the declaration. Mrs. Keene clutched her rosary, whispering a quiet prayer, while Violet's hands trembled at her side. The weight of responsibility pressed upon them, all the burden of care, the fear of contagion, the inevitability of suffering that could not be ignored. Lord Harrowfield finally lifted his gaze, eyes filled with a mixture of disbelief and dawning horror. "Then, what must be done?" he demanded, voice trembling. "How do we contain it? How do we protect those who remain?" Dr. Pembroke's fingers tapped lightly on the ledger. "Isolation, strict boiling of all water, and careful monitoring. No shared utensils, no contact without precaution. Those already infected must be attended to in separate rooms with proper sanitation, and the household must be vigilant, every servant, every child, every adult without exception." Lady Harrowfield's hands shook as she clutched the armrests of her chair. "And the neighbors?" she whispered. "Will this reach beyond our walls?" "Likely," Dr. Pembroke admitted. "The contamination may extend to adjoining households, especially if water sources are interconnected. Time is critical." The room fell silent again, the shadows lengthening as the flickering firelight danced along the walls. Each occupant absorbed the weight of the truth, the enormity of the invisible threat pressing down like the fog outside. The household, once confident in its privilege and refinement, was now forced to confront a reality that respected neither wealth nor order. Violet's eyes strayed to the polished crystal pitchers, the gleaming taps, the rosewood baths, instruments of comfort turned vectors of peril. She pressed a hand to her chest, heart hammering, understanding fully that the invisible enemy had already infiltrated the veins of the house. And behind the drawn curtains, the fog swirled against the windowpanes, patient, unyielding, as if aware that the decisions made in this quiet, tense room would determine which lives the disease would claim next. The Harrowfield estate, usually a bastion of order and decorum, had grown restless under the shadow of its invisible intruder. Fever had crept steadily through the household, claiming servants and family alike, leaving a pall of fear so dense that even the polished walls seemed to hold their breath. By nightfall, the oppressive quiet had become unbearable, and the once proud manor seemed to pulse with anticipation, as though it had learned the rhythm of disease and now waited patiently for the next victim. It was Lord Harrowfield who first suggested flight, a word almost unthinkable in the vocabulary of Belgravia's refined elite. "We must leave," he said in the drawing-room, voice low but taut with urgency. "At least for a night, until the fever abates." Lady Harrowfield's eyes widened. Her pride, so long a shield against the intrusion of the ordinary and the base, quivered under the weight of reality. To leave one's home in haste, to abandon carefully arranged curtains, polished silver, and the golden faucets that had betrayed them, was unthinkable. Yet even she could not deny the truth. The house no longer offered sanctuary. It had become a crucible. By midnight, the decision was made. Carriages, cloaked in mist and pulled by horses shivering against the chill, were brought to the front gates. The household moved with meticulous haste, servants carrying precious items, hastily packed linens, and trays of what food could be spared. Each step along the polished floors echoed through corridors now empty of laughter, filled only with the soft, persistent coughs of the fevered. Violet Dawes carried a small bundle of water, her hands trembling, the metallic tang she had noticed for days lingering faintly in her memory. The fog pressed against the gates like a living thing, curling around carriage wheels, coiling along cobblestones, and swallowing the quiet clatter of boots and wheels. The city beyond Belgravia seemed still, as if it too held its breath, aware of the silent intruder moving through pipes, pitchers, and copper kettles. No lamp outside could pierce the mist, and the manor, abandoned for the first time in its long history, appeared spectral, its windows like eyes, watching, waiting, impotent to intervene. Inside, the empty rooms told stories that words could not. The nursery remained faintly warm, a blanket half draped over Cecily's crib. The rosewood bath, polished and gleaming, sat untouched but ready, its surface reflecting the gaslight like a dark promise. The crystal pitchers rested on the sideboard, the water long poured and gone, yet still imbued with the memory of its treachery. Even the golden faucets seemed to droop with silent accusation, their brilliance tarnished by complicity. The fevered house, left behind in haste, seemed to pulse with anticipation. Every corridor held a memory of coughs, every stair creaked with the weight of those who had succumbed. The servants' quarters, so meticulously arranged, were now the epicenter of an illness that moved with quiet precision, patient and merciless. Hester's journal had chronicled the symptoms, each line a testament to the invisible assault, but even ink could not contain the spread. By the time the carriages had cleared the gates, the manor was enveloped in fog, the faint glow of lanterns swallowed by the night. London itself remained indifferent, streets wet with dew, and the mist curling into alleyways, into the hearts of those unaware, carrying the silent promise of the unseen. The estate, once a sanctuary of wealth and order, now stood as a hushed monument to vulnerability, a warning that luxury, elegance, and golden faucets could not protect against what flowed silently through water, air, and veins alike. The Harrowfields had fled, but the house remained, patient and silent, a vessel for disease, shadows, and dread. And somewhere in the walls, behind the polished doors and along the pipes, the fever waited, ready to resume its quiet march through every corner of a home that had once believed itself untouchable. The early morning fog pressed thick against the platform at King's Cross, curling in pale, ghostly fingers around iron railings and the polished wheels of the awaiting train. Inside the carriage bound for the countryside, the Harrowfields sat in silence, each wrapped in layers of wool and anxiety, each bearing the subtle flush of fever and the weight of dread. The journey was meant to offer escape, a brief reprieve from the creeping disease that had infiltrated their Belgravia home. But the very air in the carriage seemed infused with the invisible intruder they sought to flee. Cecily sat closest to the window, her small hands folded over her lap, eyes wide with the strange awareness only children possess when the world has become simultaneously familiar and terrifying. Her cheeks were flushed, the faint gleam of sweat along her hairline visible even in the muted light filtered through fogged glass. She pressed a finger to the pane, watching the mist curl along the tracks, oblivious to the danger, yet somehow sensing it in the tremor of her own pulse. Lady Harrowfield occupied the seat across the aisle, her posture rigid, her gloved hands clasped tightly in her lap. She sipped intermittently from a porcelain cup of tea, each careful movement betraying the tremor beneath her composure. Her skin, pale where fever had not yet claimed it, glowed faintly under the lamplight, as if the invisible intruder had traced its path into her veins even before arrival in the carriage. Her eyes, though wide and alert, betrayed a flicker of panic she refused to name. She kept her gaze fixed on the muted landscape outside, watching the fog undulate across distant fields, as though the countryside might offer sanctuary from the invisible menace, trailing them from home. Lord Harrowfield sat near the door, a handkerchief pressed to his lips after a fitful cough. Each breath he drew seemed measured, deliberate, an attempt to maintain control over a body betrayed by unseen forces. His hands gripped the edge of the seat, knuckles white, while his mind churned through the endless possibilities of containment, the failure of precaution, and the cruel efficiency of a disease that knew no rank or pedigree. Even as he attempted to comfort himself with thoughts of distance and isolation, he could not ignore the silent fact that the water, the faucets, the copper pots, and the crystal pitchers that had carried the contagion were already present in every drop he had drunk. The carriage itself was subdued, filled with a quiet tension. The occasional rustle of a coat, the faint scrape of a boot against polished wood, and the soft murmur of conversation among the few attendants present were the only sounds. The passengers' faces were pale, drawn, each reflecting the invisible shadow that had followed them from Belgravia. Even the train, usually a symbol of modernity and progress, felt complicit, its wheels turning smoothly along the rails, carrying them away from home, yet unable to sever the connection to the disease embedded in their very bodies. Violet Dawes moved silently among the passengers, attending to the children, distributing cups of water that had been boiled and filtered, yet still failing to erase the subtle metallic tang that clung to her senses. She watched Lady Harrowfield sip carefully, noting the slight tremor of her hand. She observed Lord Harrowfield's restless movements, the shiver that ran through his shoulders with each cough, and she feared for the child, fragile and fevered, whose tiny body might not withstand the relentless advance of the invisible intruder. Outside, the fog swirled over the tracks, pressing in from every direction, obscuring vision and sound. Within, the carriage seemed suspended between worlds, one of apparent civility, order, and wealth, the other of fear, fever, and unrelenting disease. The Harrowfields had fled the house, but escape offered no sanctuary. The fever had followed them, invisible and patient, moving with them along the rails, waiting for each breath, each sip, each trembling pulse to claim its next victim. And as the train pressed on into the grey, indifferent morning, it carried with it a family enveloped in silence, pallor, and the cruel certainty that no distance, no wealth, and no precaution could halt the silent march of the unseen enemy. The news travelled swiftly through the city, carried first in hushed whispers behind lace curtains, then through the quiet murmur of tea rooms and riding clubs. It was the sort of story that no one wanted to speak aloud, yet could not help but acknowledge. The Duchess of Kensington, a figure of refined elegance and societal command, had fallen ill. Her illness was no common fever, no fleeting malaise. It was the silent, insidious reach of typhoid, the same invisible intruder that had invaded the Harrowfield household, now touching even the highest ranks of London society. The city recoiled in muted shock. In the Harrowfield estate, Lady Harrowfield read the announcement in the morning paper, her fingers trembling over the fine print. The headline, composed with careful decorum, seemed almost to mock her. A scandal of health, illness strikes the Duchess of Kensington. The words shimmered with significance. Each letter a reminder that no amount of silk, no drawing room filled with mirrors, no polished brass or golden faucet could shield the wealthy from the reach of contagion. She folded the paper with care, though her hands shook, and placed it on the side table beside the rosewood armchair. Across the room, Lord Harrowfield coughed into his handkerchief, the colour draining further from his face. Even the servants, normally silent and disciplined, exchanged nervous glances, their whispered speculation contained only by the weight of fear. Violet Dawes moved quietly through the room, arranging tea and clean linens, though her mind was elsewhere. She had seen the fever spread through the household, had tended to Miss Clark and the children, and had observed Lady Harrowfield's own subtle symptoms. The news of the Duchess's affliction only sharpened her apprehension. If the disease could reach the highest echelon of society, there was no sanctuary, there was no immunity. It did not discriminate. Every polished surface, every crystal glass, every meticulously scrubbed basin was vulnerable. The servants' quarters buzzed softly with rumour. Hester, the nurse, read the morning papers aloud, her voice low and deliberate. The Duchess, fever, typhoid. It spread silently, indiscriminately. The words seemed to echo through the narrow corridors, bouncing off the wooden floors and pressed ceiling beams. The staff listened with rapt attention, recognizing in the narrative a pattern they had witnessed firsthand. The unseen menace carried in water, in pipes, in vessels meant to provide comfort. Outside, fog pressed low over the streets, curling around lampposts and the wrought-iron fences of Belgravia, thick and unyielding. It seemed to carry the weight of unspoken dread, pressing against windows and doors as though to remind every household that the illness knew no boundaries. London itself became complicit, a city shrouded in grey, where the invisible enemy moved through conduits of water and fear alike. Lady Harrowfield set the paper aside, her breath shallow. "If it can reach the Duchess," she whispered, almost to herself, "then none of us are safe." Her voice trembled with a rare admission, unspoken for hours. She glanced toward Cecily, fevered and restless in her small bed, and felt the icy weight of inevitability settle over her. The disease was patient, it was indiscriminate, it was unstoppable. Dr. Pembroke had warned them, had spoken of the water, of the faucets, of the crystal pitchers and copper pots that carried the intruder into every chamber. But even he could not quell the fear that now gripped the estate, fear magnified by the Duchess's fall. It was no longer a distant threat, confined to servants and minor estates. It had breached the walls of the elite. It had taken one who was untouchable, a figure whose very presence had symbolized wealth, power, and prestige. And as the fog thickened outside, curling in upon the estate like a living thing, the household understood in a quiet, unspoken moment that the Duchess's illness was more than a story. It was a warning, a stark, undeniable signal that wealth offered no refuge, that elegance and refinement could not protect against the silent, patient, and unrelenting hand of the fever that now haunted every corner of London. The pump house at the edge of the Harrowfield estate had always been a quiet, utilitarian structure. Its brick walls, darkened with age, concealed a network of pipes and conduits that fed the house's faucets, baths, and kitchens. By day, it was a place of mundane labor, the turning of valves, the creak of wooden handles, the rhythmic swish of water drawn to basins and pitchers. By night, however, it had become something more sinister, a locus of suspicion, a site of fear, a place where the invisible enemy coursed through the veins of the household. Dr. Pembroke and Inspector Whitrow arrived together in the early grey of morning, their boots crunching softly against frost-coated gravel. The fog clung to the walls of the estate, curling around the pump house like a living shroud, muffling sound and swallowing light. The two men approached the brick structure cautiously, aware that the smallest disturbance might carry consequences beyond mere observation. Inside, the air smelled faintly of damp stone and iron, a scent that had become almost synonymous with the creeping dread that gripped the household. The doctor lifted the lid of the main cistern first. Water shimmered faintly in the dim morning light, reflecting the trembling glow of the lantern Whitrow held aloft. Dr. Pembroke inhaled slowly, noting the metallic tang that lingered in the air, subtle, yet unmistakable. It was the same faint note Violet had reported, the same that had haunted his own senses during his rounds of the estate. He dipped a gloved hand into the water, lifting a sample for closer inspection. Even without the benefit of modern testing, he could sense the contamination invisible, insidious, already lethal. Whitrow moved to trace the pipes, lantern swinging gently to illuminate each junction, each valve, each junction where the water might mingle with waste or runoff. The inspector's face tightened with each discovery. A small leak at the joint nearest the servants' quarters, a corroded pipe feeding the nursery, a faint trace of sediment along the conduit supplying the main kitchen. Every flaw, once minor and easily overlooked, now bore the weight of deadly consequence. "They will not comprehend," Dr. Pembroke said softly, more to himself than to Whitrow. The family will see only polished floors, clean basins, golden faucets, and assume sanctuary. Yet the danger is beneath it all, invisible, patient, unrelenting. Whitrow nodded grimly. The evidence is clear. Contamination is present in multiple sections of the system. It explains the spread of fever throughout the household, even to those who have been most cautious. And if the main feed is compromised, it will extend to neighboring homes. Dr. Pembroke shivered. He had treated fevered patients before, in crowded slums and tenements where squalor had been expected. But this contamination reaching a home of wealth and elegance was unprecedented. Each faucet, each kettle, each crystal pitcher was now a potential instrument of disease, a vector moving silently through every polished corner of the estate. He traced the waterline toward the nursery cistern, noting the proximity to the old well in the garden. The shadows of the early morning seemed to lengthen, pressing in as though aware of the inspection. Whitrow's lantern flickered against the walls, casting distorted reflections across brick and pipe. The inspector stepped carefully, aware that every motion might disturb unseen hazards. "We must act quickly," Whitrow said. "Isolation, boiling, careful monitoring, and the family must be warned gently, yes, but without delay. Delay will cost lives." Dr. Pembroke pressed a gloved hand to his temple. "The water has betrayed them," he murmured. "The pumps, the pipes, the cisterns, all instruments of their undoing." Outside, the fog pressed against the brick, curling in through small cracks and seams. Inside, the pump house seemed almost sentient, aware of its role in the silent conquest of the Harrowfield estate. Water, once life, now carried death. The disease had found its conduit. And beneath the polished floors, behind velvet curtains and golden faucets, it moved, patient, invisible, unyielding. The drawing room, once a sanctuary of elegance and conversation, had transformed into a theatre of quiet desperation. Its walls, lined with gilded mirrors and heavy draperies, now seemed to close in on the occupants, reflecting their fear as vividly as the gaslight reflected their pallid faces. Lady Harrowfield reclined on a chaise, a damp cloth pressed to her brow, while Lord Harrowfield sat upright in his armchair, hands clenched around a handkerchief as he coughed softly, each breath uneven and laboured. Between them, trays of remedies, herbal infusions, tinctures, and powders, imported from distant apothecaries, cluttered the polished surface of the mahogany table. Dr. Pembroke moved among them silently, inspecting each vessel, each spoonful, each suggestion of relief with the practiced eye of one accustomed to suffering. Yet he could not ignore the futility of it all. Fevered bodies, delicate and resistant only to the most careful hands, would not be saved by mere ritual or superstition. The remedies, though crafted with the utmost care and purchased at great expense, were powerless against the invisible intruder that had taken hold of the house. Lady Harrowfield's hands trembled as she reached for a cup of chamomile tea. Her skin glistened with a sheen of perspiration that betrayed her composed expression. She sipped carefully, willing herself to believe that warmth and ritual might hold the fever at bay, might preserve her body against what had already claimed servants and the governess. Her eyes, however, reflected the truth she refused to name aloud. The remedies were only symbols, tokens of control in a household where control had long since slipped away. Lord Harrowfield coughed again, this time with a sharpness that made Violet Dawes flinch. She approached with a small vial of powdered salts, her hands steady despite the terror that had gripped her since the first symptoms appeared. "Sir, perhaps this will ease the discomfort," she whispered. His eyes, usually imperious, softened with exhaustion as he accepted the powder, yet the tremor in his fingers betrayed his awareness of its limited effect. The servants, too, moved with the precision of ritual rather than efficacy. Towels were dampened and pressed to foreheads, sponges soaked in scented water were placed at pulse points, and herbal infusions were delivered at measured intervals. Each act was performed with care, yet each was undercut by the knowledge that the disease moved silently, relentlessly, through the golden faucets, the copper pots, and the crystal pitchers that had once symbolized purity and order. Hester, the nurse, moved between the children and adults with quiet efficiency, recording temperatures and pulses in her journal, noting every tremor and flush with meticulous detail. "It spreads quickly," she murmured to Violet as they adjusted the blankets around Cecily. "Even with careful attention, the illness will claim those it touches." Her voice was low, almost drowned beneath the muted sighs and soft coughs that filled the room. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows like a living thing, curling its way into the smallest cracks, carrying with it the faint, metallic tang of the water that had betrayed the household. Inside, the drawing room seemed suspended in a fragile balance between hope and despair. Every remedy, every infusion, every whispered prayer was a bulwark against the invisible tide of illness, yet each felt woefully insufficient. Lady Harrowfield glanced at the remedies once more, her gaze lingering on the powdered salts, the teas, the tinctures. Each was a symbol of civility, of wealth, of control, yet symbols offered no defense against the fever that had infiltrated every chamber of her home. She pressed the cloth to her brow again, closed her eyes, and felt the weight of inevitability settle upon her chest. The drawing room, with all its mirrors, all its gilding, all its candles, had become a theatre not of comfort but of helplessness, a testament to the cruelty of an unseen enemy that spared neither wealth nor refinement. The streets of Belgravia, usually alive with the measured cadence of carriage wheels and the crisp click of polished boots, lay under a pall of silence that felt almost unnatural. A fog, thick and unrelenting, curled through alleys and avenues, swallowing lamplight and muffling sound, so that even the distant tolling of a church bell seemed hesitant, as though the city itself dared not disturb the encroaching dread. Within this grey hush, the Harrowfield household sent its carriages rolling through the streets, the first deliberate movement since the fever had tightened its grip within the walls of their estate. The horses moved with a wary precision, hooves striking the wet cobbles in subdued rhythm. Their riders, bundled in coats and shawls, leaned close to the polished dashboards, faces pale beneath the gaslit gloom. No laughter, no conversation, no clatter of social ritual accompanied the passage. The carriage doors were closed tightly against the chill, and within, the family and attendants bore their fear like a second skin, heavy and oppressive. Cecily, curled beneath a shawl, shivered not from cold but from fever. Her small hands clutched the folds of the wool, and her bright eyes, though drowsy, betrayed awareness of the strange tension in the carriage. She could feel it in the pause of every breath, in the quiet, measured movements of the attendants, in the barely perceptible tremor of her mother's fingers as they rested upon her lap. The fever had infiltrated her little body, and with each bump of the wheels along the cobblestones, the invisible intruder traced its path more insistently, as patient and unyielding as the fog pressed against the carriage windows. Lady Harrowfield, seated stiffly across from her daughter, pressed a gloved hand to her cheek. Her skin was flushed beneath the lamp's glow, sweat dampening her hairline. She sipped from a small cup of tea, each careful swallow a fragile assertion of composure, yet the tremor in her hands betrayed her inner tumult. Her gaze, fixed on the thickened fog outside, darted to the edges of the carriage, noting the soft rustle of attendants, adjusting blankets or carrying trays of boiled water. Every movement was laden with caution, as if the slightest misstep might awaken the invisible enemy she refused to name aloud. Lord Harrowfield, seated nearest the door, coughed quietly into a handkerchief, the sound muffled yet heavy with significance. The fever had begun to claim him as well, and the colour in his face was pale, leached of the dignity he usually displayed. He pressed the handkerchief over his mouth, eyes fixed on the darkened streets, aware that their flight offered little protection. The disease had followed them, invisible, unrelenting, carried within the water they had already consumed, within the very air they breathed. Violet Dawes, seated quietly behind the carriage driver, watched the household with an intensity born of responsibility and fear. Her hands rested in her lap, yet each finger itched to intervene, to prepare, to protect. She thought of the copper pot, the crystal pitchers, the golden faucets, conduits of the illness that had spread silently, inexorably. Every step of the horses, every turn of the wheels, seemed to carry them closer to safety. Yet she knew the enemy had already taken root in those they loved. The fog thickened as the carriages pressed on, enveloping the household in a muted, ghostly world. Street lamps appeared as distant, trembling orbs, casting weak reflections on wet cobblestones. Windows along the avenue remained shuttered, houses silent, as if the city itself had withdrawn in recognition of the invisible threat moving among its citizens. And within the carriages, the Harrowfields sat in tense silence, hearts heavy, pulses quickened by both fever and fear. The disease had followed them from the manor, relentless, patient, invisible, carried in water, air, and blood alike. No wealth, no refinement, no carefully polished brass or gilded surface could stave it off. The silent parade of carriages rolled through Belgravia, carrying a family unprepared for the reach of the unseen intruder, and the city, thick with fog and foreboding, watched quietly as the first steps of a retreat offered no true refuge. Dr. Pembroke arrived at Westminster under a sky muted and heavy with fog, the air damp and laden with the faint, acrid scent of coal smoke that pressed into every corner of London. Inside the Grand Chamber of Parliament, voices usually sharp and decisive now carried a tentative, almost reluctant cadence. Members shifted uneasily in their seats, polished boots tapping softly against the cold, gleaming floor. Outside, the streets were deserted, the fog curling around the river and along the cobbled avenues like a silent witness to the disease it had already begun to claim. The doctor carried with him not only papers and reports, but the weight of the Harrowfield household and countless others across the city, a burden too immense to be borne lightly. He rose to address the assembly, the polished oak of the speaker's desk reflecting the flicker of gas lamps along the chamber walls. His gloves, once pristine, bore faint stains from weeks of tending the fevered, from hours of note-taking under candlelight, from the relentless labor of observing, recording, and attempting to mitigate the spread of the invisible intruder. His voice, when it emerged, was quiet yet resonant, carrying the cadence of authority tempered by exhaustion. "Gentlemen," he began, "and ladies present, I come not to speak of theory, nor of speculation, but of observation of facts drawn from the homes of this city, from its streets, from the very vessels that are meant to sustain life. Typhoid fever is no longer confined to the poor nor to the unobservant. It has entered households of wealth, of refinement, of education and influence. It is patient, it is invisible, and it is indiscriminate." A faint murmur rippled through the chamber. Some members shifted uncomfortably, glancing at one another. Wealth, they believed, conferred protection. Refinement suggested immunity. Yet Dr. Pembroke's gaze, steady and unwavering, swept across the assembly and carried with it the undeniable weight of experience. "I speak," he continued, "of homes where crystal pitchers gleam upon sideboards, where rosewood baths are polished, where golden faucets promise purity. Yet these instruments of comfort have become conduits for disease. The Harrowfield household, an estate of esteem, of careful order, has suffered. Servants, children, even the mistress of the house herself have succumbed, and the water that runs beneath the city, through pipes neglected and cracked, threatens to carry this illness further if immediate measures are not taken." He paused, letting the silence grow heavy, palpable. Every member felt the weight of the words, the implication that their polished lives offered no safeguard, that every uninspected conduit, every hidden well, every carelessly assumed source of purity could serve as a vehicle for death. "The city," he said finally, voice low but intense, "requires immediate legislation. Sanitation must be enforced, inspections made rigorous, and public awareness heightened. Boiling of water, isolation of the infected, and strict monitoring are not mere recommendations, they are imperatives, without which countless lives will be claimed, regardless of social standing." A cough echoed from the gallery, faint yet sharp. It reminded the assembly of the urgency they preferred to ignore, of the invisible threat pressing upon their very veins. Dr. Pembroke's hands, folded lightly on the desk, trembled slightly, though not from fear but from the knowledge of the lives dependent upon swift action. He concluded, "We may no longer afford the luxury of denial. The disease does not wait for convenience, nor for debate. It moves silently, inexorably, and only through decisive, immediate action may we prevent further tragedy." As he stepped back, the chamber remained quiet, the weight of his testimony pressing upon every conscience. Outside, fog wrapped itself around Westminster, the Thames curling in gentle eddies, and London seemed to hold its breath, waiting for those with authority to heed the warning. Dr. Pembroke knew that the unseen enemy did not relent, and he left the chamber with the certainty that the battle for life and sanity had only begun, and that the wealth, pride, and refinement of the city could not alone preserve it. By mid-morning, the Harrowfield household had descended into a rhythm, dictated not by civility or decorum, but by fear. Every surface, every utensil, every vessel that had once been a symbol of refinement now bore suspicion. Even the tea ritual, the cornerstone of Victorian elegance, had become an act fraught with dread. Cups, once polished to a gleam, were scalded before use. Saucers were boiled. Spoons were immersed repeatedly in the fire of boiling water, and yet every act of sanitation carried the faint, suffocating realization: it may already be too late. Violet Dawes moved with painstaking care, the tray of utensils trembling in her hands as she carried them from the scullery to the drawing-room. Steam rose from the freshly scalded china, curling in slow, ghostly spirals that caught the morning light filtering through the thick curtains. Each curl seemed a silent testament to the household's collective terror, an almost sentient reminder that the invisible intruder continued its patient, relentless march, flowing through the water, through copper pots, through crystal pitchers, through polished faucets that promised purity but offered none. Lady Harrowfield sat upright in her chair, her hands folded tightly over a damp handkerchief. Her skin glistened with perspiration, the flush of fever painted faintly across her cheeks. She watched Violet's careful movements, eyes wide, yet refusing to meet the full truth. Every scalded cup, every boiled saucer, every repeated effort at purification was a fragile talisman against a danger she could not see but felt pressing against the walls, the furniture, the very air she breathed. Lord Harrowfield, seated nearby, coughed quietly into a handkerchief, the edges stained faintly with blood from the morning's violent fits. His hands trembled slightly as he accepted the teacup offered to him, fingers brushing against the edge with a hesitance born of knowledge and fear. Even wealth could not shield him from the reach of the invisible enemy. He sipped slowly, deliberately, as though the care of his actions could stave off what had already begun. The children, fevered and restless, sat under Hester's watchful gaze. Cecily clutched a small blanket, shivering despite the warmth of the room, her lips dry, her cheeks painted with the pale rose of fever. The nurse had boiled each cup for her, scalded each spoon, washed every utensil in repeated cycles, and yet she too knew the limitations of ritual against a disease that moved silently, indifferently, through every conduit of domestic life. Violet placed the tray carefully on the table, stepping back to allow Lady Harrowfield to lift her cup. The steam rose in gentle coils, carrying the faint metallic tang of the water beneath the scent of tea. Every sip, every careful handling, was an act of defiance, an assertion of control in a household where control had long since begun to slip away. And yet, beneath the ritual, beneath the civility, the disease pressed onward, imperceptible and unrelenting. The servants whispered softly, exchanging furtive glances as they scolded the next round of cups. Each movement was deliberate, precise, yet tinged with despair. They had long since abandoned hope of keeping the family untouched. Their vigilance now served only to slow the inevitable, to buy hours in which the fever could be observed, measured, and perhaps mitigated, though never truly contained. Outside, the fog clung to the estate, curling along the hedges, pressing against the windows, a silent witness to the household's anxious measures. The Harrowfields moved with the rituals of civility, each scalded teacup a fragile shield against an enemy that respected neither wealth nor order, a silent acknowledgement that even the finest china could not purify the water coursing through their veins. And so, as the steam rose and the cups were scalded again and again, the invisible intruder waited, patient and unyielding, within the polished vessels, ready to continue its inexorable advance. The grand halls of Belgravia, usually alive with the laughter and chatter of London's elite, lay silent. The gaslights glimmered faintly through drawn curtains, casting pale reflections upon polished floors and gilded walls. Music, once a central rhythm of the social season, had been replaced by the stifled coughs and fevered whispers of households besieged by an invisible, relentless intruder. The ballroom, once a theatre of elegance and display, now stood empty, its mirrors reflecting only shadows, and the faint shimmer of dust disturbed by the occasional servant. Lady Harrowfield's salons, which had been planned weeks in advance for evenings of music, tea, and conversation, were abandoned. Invitations, carefully scripted and sealed with wax, went unanswered, returned, or left untouched, gathering dust in the drawing rooms where polished silver and crystal waited in vain. The social season, a symbol of wealth, refinement, and order, had evaporated like morning mist before the steady, patient spread of illness. No ball, no luncheon, no soirée could exist, while fever raged quietly within the homes of the city's elite. The Harrowfields themselves remained confined, their movements measured, each breath calculated. Lady Harrowfield reclined on a chaise, a damp cloth pressed to her brow, her gloved hands trembling slightly as she reached for a cup of boiled tea. Her cheeks were flushed with fever, her eyes wide with the strain of watching the household she had managed with rigid precision fall into chaos. Lord Harrowfield sat upright in a nearby armchair, coughing into a handkerchief, the edges faintly stained, his chest rising and falling in shallow, irregular rhythms. Cecily, fevered and restless, lay beneath layers of blankets, watched over by Hester, whose hands were busy with thermometers, cloths, and carefully prepared infusions. Outside, the fog pressed low across the streets, curling around lamp-posts and gates, and blanketing the avenues in an eerie hush. The usual procession of carriages, of gentlemen in polished boots and ladies in silk and velvet, had ceased. Even the church bells seemed muted, as if London itself had recognized the threat of a disease that ignored status and refinement. The city, usually vibrant and bustling, had become a silent witness to the unfolding crisis, aware that wealth and privilege were no barriers to the relentless spread of illness. Within the Harrowfield estate, servants moved quietly, performing their duties with an efficiency born of necessity, their faces pale, eyes shadowed with fear. Violet doors carried trays of scalded cups, copper pots, and boiled water, each movement precise, deliberate, yet tinged with the awareness that her efforts, however careful, could not reverse the course of the disease already embedded in the household. Hester monitored the children and the fevered adults, recording every pulse, every tremor, every slight rise in temperature. Even with their vigilance, the invisible intruder moved onward, indifferent to the rituals of care, to the polished floors, to the gilded fixtures that had once symbolized safety. Letters were dispatched to acquaintances, carefully worded, vague in detail, emphasizing precaution while concealing the fear that had gripped the household. Invitations were withdrawn, dances postponed indefinitely, and the social calendar, once filled with promise and display, lay abandoned. Wealth, refinement, and influence offered no protection. The city's elite, who had long prided themselves on immunity to the miseries of the lower classes, now understood with stark clarity that disease recognized no boundaries. The season that had once marked the height of culture and civility in London had ended not with scandal, nor with misfortune, but with silence, a silence punctuated by coughing, fevered sighs, and the quiet, patient advance of an invisible threat. The social season would not return that year, nor the next, and the Harrowfields, like so many of their peers, were forced to confront a grim truth. Elegance and wealth could not shield them from what flowed silently through water, through pipes, and through the very veins of their city. The Harrowfield estate, once a sanctuary of polished wood, gilded mirrors, and velvet-draped elegance, had become something unrecognizable. The halls, echoing with the soft footfalls of servants and the faint creak of worn floorboards, now resonated with the muted groans and coughs of fevered bodies. The disease that had entered through water, through faucets, through vessels of domestic refinement, had transformed the household into a makeshift infirmary, a mansion repurposed as a hospital against its owner's will. Lanterns flickered in corridors, usually lit by polished chandeliers, casting shadows that stretched and quivered across the walls like the silent spectre of the unseen intruder. Rooms that had once been parlors and studies now held beds hastily arranged for the afflicted. Linen, boiled repeatedly and draped over furniture, served as temporary partitions to isolate the sick. Copper pots, once used to pour water and tea, now collected washings and purged fluids, their metallic surfaces gleaming faintly with the reflection of fear. Lady Harrowfield lay propped against a chaise in the former drawing-room, fever burning beneath her skin. Each breath was measured, each movement deliberate, as though the act of breathing itself were a negotiation with the disease pressing against her body. Her gloved hands clutched a damp cloth pressed to her brow, yet she could not still the tremor in her fingers. The house, polished and pristine, had surrendered its order to the fever that moved unseen through its veins. Lord Harrowfield occupied a narrow bed in what had once been the library. He coughed quietly, the sound muffled but persistent, each breath shallow and labored. The leather-bound books that lined the walls seemed to recoil, as if aware of the intrusion, their pages whispering secrets of human fragility. He pressed a hand to his chest, feeling the pulse of fever and dread, aware that the household's routines, rituals, and refinement offered no sanctuary from the invisible enemy now coursing through the very conduits meant to sustain life. Cecily, fevered and restless, lay in a crib transformed into a temporary ward, blankets layered over her small frame. Hester, the nurse, moved silently beside her, recording temperatures, pulses, and symptoms in a leather-bound journal that had become a chronicle of inevitability. Every movement was careful, deliberate, precise, a feeble barrier against the relentless progression of illness that had already claimed Miss Clark and the household's butler. Even Violet, whose hands had been steady through weeks of care, trembled now as she attended the children and prepared bowls of boiled water, the metallic tang lingering faintly beneath the scent of chamomile. The servants' quarters, once bustling with orderly activity, had become a chamber of whispered fear. Pallor, shivering, and faint moans filled the narrow corridors. Every room, every corridor, every polished surface bore witness to the disease's silent conquest. The mansion, vast and elegant, had surrendered to the rhythms of fever and care, its walls absorbing the scent of sweat, medicinal herbs, and despair. Lanterns swung in the corridors, throwing long shadows across the floor, and the once gilded mirrors reflected nothing of beauty, only the faint sheen of illness on skin and the hollow weight in the eyes of those who watched over the sick. The golden faucets, the crystal pitchers, the rosewood baths, all now symbols of betrayal, conduits of contamination, glimmered faintly under the flickering light. Outside, the fog pressed low against the estate, wrapping it in a cloak of silence. The city, distant and indifferent, continued unaware, oblivious to the mansion that had become a vessel of disease. Within, the Harrowfields and their attendants moved with purpose and dread, caught between duty and fear, witnessing daily the relentless progression of the invisible intruder. The mansion had become a hospital not by choice, but by necessity, and within its walls, the line between home and infirmary had dissolved completely, leaving only the patient, the caretaker, and the patientless vigil of an estate overtaken by fever. The chambers of Westminster echoed faintly with the measured footsteps of officials, their polished boots striking the cold stone floors with a rhythm both deliberate and uneasy. Outside, fog clung to the city streets like a persistent shadow, curling around lamp-posts and wrought-iron railings, weaving through alleys and across cobblestones, a silent witness to the invisible plague that had infiltrated London. Within the halls of power, the voices of Parliament had finally grown aware of a truth that had long been whispered in private parlours and servant quarters. Wealth, refinement, and elegance offered no protection against the quiet, relentless march of disease. Dr. Pembroke stood before the assembly, a stack of carefully prepared documents in hand. His face, pale beneath the glare of gaslight, bore the marks of exhaustion, lines etched by fevered nights, eyes shadowed by the constant weight of observation, hands trembling faintly as he adjusted the papers. He spoke with a gravity that silenced the murmurs of those accustomed to debating matters of policy and profit. "Gentlemen, ladies," he began, voice low but precise, "we have seen what occurs when vigilance is absent and infrastructure is neglected. The Harrowfield household, a residence of the highest refinement, has suffered. Children, servants, and their elders have been struck by fever, their only sin being proximity to contaminated water and neglected pipes. The disease does not respect wealth. It flows silently through conduits once trusted to provide life, and it will continue to do so unless decisive action is taken." The assembly listened, uneasy, aware that the invisible threat that had begun in private homes now bore consequences for the city at large. Some shuffled papers nervously, others exchanged whispered glances. The room, usually vibrant with debate and rhetoric, seemed suspended in tense anticipation. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows as though the city itself leaned in to hear, to witness, to weigh the deliberations that would determine the course of countless lives. Dr. Pembroke continued, outlining the measures necessary to curtail the advance of the illness. Sanitation inspections, strict regulation of water supplies, enforced boiling in households of all ranks, and the establishment of monitoring for fevered individuals, all were presented with the urgency of one who had witnessed the consequences of inaction firsthand. He described the harrowing scenes within the Harrowfield mansion, the fevered governess, the trembling children, the servants' quarters transformed into a chamber of suffering, and the house itself, once a sanctuary of civility, converted into a makeshift infirmary. "The wealthiest households are not immune," he said, letting the words hang in the gaslit chamber. "Golden faucets, crystal pitchers, rosewood baths, all have betrayed those who trusted them. The disease is patient, invisible, and indifferent. Only legislation and immediate enforcement can prevent further catastrophe." Slowly, the murmurs began to swell into consensus. Members of Parliament, who had long believed that illness was a problem confined to the poor, now realized the peril that extended across the social spectrum. Recommendations became motions, motions became decrees, and decrees became the law. Sanitation measures were strengthened, water supplies inspected and regulated, and households required to observe strict boiling and isolation procedures. The invisible intruder, relentless though it had been, would now face barriers constructed not of brass and marble, but of law and vigilance. Outside, fog shifted and thinned in pale currents, as though the city itself breathed a tentative sigh. The legislation marked a turning point, a recognition that society, wealthy and poor alike, could not afford to ignore the channels through which disease flowed. Within the Harrowfield estate, fevered bodies continued to shiver beneath blankets and linen, but the knowledge that the city's hand had intervened, however belatedly, offered a fragile hope. The law, once abstract and distant, now cast its shadow over the avenues and mansions, promising that the invisible march of illness might finally be slowed. And in every chamber, corridor, and polished room of London, a subtle shift had begun. Vigilance enforced, risk acknowledged, and the quiet, unrelenting foe forced, at last, to contend with something more enduring than wealth, the law. The Harrowfield estate, now quiet in its aftermath, seemed to breathe with a memory of fever and fear. The polished floors, gilded mirrors, and golden faucets stood as silent witnesses to the ordeal that had claimed servants, children, and the proud mistress herself. Every corner of the house retained the subtle scent of perspiration, lavender, and antiseptic, the residual echo of a battle waged silently and invisibly through water and pipes. The lessons of those weeks, though harsh, were inscribed not in ink, but in the very veins of the household, flowing as inexorably as the disease that had brought it low. Lady Harrowfield, frail yet alert, leaned against the edge of the chaise in the drawing-room, eyes tracing the pale light across the polished surfaces. Each reflection in the mirrors, each glint from crystal pitchers, seemed to carry the memory of what had transpired, a silent admonition of complacency and pride. She had survived, but not without cost. Strength diminished, the subtle tremor in her hands, a permanent reminder of the fever that had coursed through her body. The golden faucets, the rosewood baths, and the carefully boiled water had offered only a fragile illusion of safety. Lord Harrowfield sat nearby, staring into a silver teapot, its surface gleaming yet impervious to the lessons it reflected. He had observed the rapid spread of illness, the vulnerability of even the most controlled household, and the helplessness of those once confident in their immunity. The servants, who had borne the brunt of exposure, were pallid and subdued, tending cautiously to the household's restoration, while whispering softly among themselves. Their vigilance had prevented further catastrophe, yet it could not erase the memory of what had been lost. Violet Dawes moved quietly through the corridors, carrying buckets of clean water and fresh linens, her face pale but resolute. She paused by the nursery, where Cecily lay resting beneath layers of blankets, her small body weakened but alive. The child's eyes, once bright and curious, now reflected the slow, lingering aftermath of fever, a reminder that the disease's reach had spared no corner of the estate. Violet pressed a hand lightly to her chest, feeling the pulse of fear and responsibility that had accompanied every task during the outbreak. She knew that the household's survival was a fragile construct, maintained by vigilance and care rather than wealth or elegance. Dr. Pembroke had departed, leaving behind detailed instructions for sanitation, isolation, and observation. The city's legislation, prompted by his testimony, had established standards intended to prevent such disasters from recurring, yet the lesson was as immediate and personal as the memory of heat on fevered skin and the metallic tang in every pitcher of water. The invisible enemy had revealed itself not through spectacle but through quiet persistence. teaching the Harrowfields and the city that status and refinement could not guard against what flowed unseen. Outside, fog pressed lightly against the windows, curling around hedges and gateposts, as if the city itself held its breath in reflection. The river shimmered pale and still, indifferent to the fragility of the lives it nourished. London, vast and indifferent, had been forced to confront its own veins, to acknowledge the conduits through which disease moved silently, patient and unrelenting. The lesson written in water was clear. Wealth offered no immunity, elegance provided no shield, and vigilance, meticulous, constant, and unceasing, was the only defense against an invisible, indifferent intruder. The Harrowfields, their household diminished yet intact, understood the truth that the golden faucets and crystal pitchers had silently conveyed. Survival was not guaranteed by privilege, but by awareness, care, and the hard-won acknowledgement of human vulnerability. And as the house exhaled in the quiet aftermath, the water in the still-filled basins reflected the faint, trembling light of the day, carrying with it the memory of fever, fear, and the lessons that would echo through the veins of the estate and the city beyond, for all who drank and all who observed.